Okay.
Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to the virtual two-day conference, Gender and Intersectionality in Post-Soviet Armenia. This conference is organized by the Zorin Institute in partnership with the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute, with the support of the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, the Arat Eskegian Museum, the UCLA Gender Studies Department, and the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. My name is Megan Reed, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Zorin Institute. And while we are all joining this conference remotely today, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the Zorin Institute operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. The Zorin Institute, its staff, and affiliates are grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. Since its inception in 1982, the Zorin Institute has been dedicated to raising awareness on issues related to genocide, human rights, and diaspora homeland relations through education and scholarship. In 2019, the Institute officially opened the Zorin Institute Armenia International Foundation for Research and Development in Yerevan, Armenia, as a place to think, research, and analyze recent history and events that impact Armenian life. With our on-the-ground presence in Armenia, we thought that this would be a perfect opportunity to host a public forum to discuss and better understand the gender-related problems that Armenian society continues to face today. The Zorin Institute wanted this conference to bridge the academic scholarship and the work being done on the ground in a multidisciplinary analysis of past and present gender-related issues. We enlisted the very generous support of Professor Melissa Bilal, who is part of the core team developing the American University of Armenia's Gender Studies program, to help us conceptualize this conference. Professor Bilal's guidance was crucial in bringing together 19 leading scholars and specialists from different parts of the world to be part of this conference. All of the panelists and panel chairs are actively involved in addressing gender-related issues in present-day Armenia, whether it be through scholarship, journalism, activism, or humanitarian efforts. It is our hope that the discussions we have over the next few days will culminate in forward-thinking observations and recommendations for decision makers in a variety of relevant sectors. This conference will feature 4 distinct panels and will take place over a 2-day period. So today we will be hearing a panel on Armenia's gender trouble, deconstructing anti-genderism from historical, linguistic, and sociocultural anthropological perspectives. And then after a brief 15-minute break, we will hear a panel on politics and representation, uprooting sexism, racism, and homophobia in education, decision-making, and public discourse. There will be a 30-minute Q&A period at the end of each session, so please submit your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we will address them at the end of the sessions. The panel chairs will be moderating these Q&A sessions. And before I pass the floor over to Professor Anne Karagosian of the Promise Armenian Institute, I would like to take this opportunity to offer my sincere appreciation to a few important people and organizations that have made this conference possible. So firstly, again, I would like to thank Professor Melissa Bilal of UCLA, who worked closely with the Institute on this conference from its initial conceptualization to the development of important themes and panel topics to its execution today. Her expertise and connections in the field have brought this incredible group of people together, and we are so grateful for her guidance and support. And I'd also like to thank Professor Victor Agajanyan of UCLA, who played an important role in assisting the Zorin Institute, and Professor Bilal in developing the panel themes and conference structure. And of course, I'd like to thank our partner organization, the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute, and specifically Professor Anne Karagosian and Hasmik Bagdasaryan for working closely with the Institute to bring all of the elements of this conference together. And I'd like to also thank our supporting institutions, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, the Ararat Eskijian Museum, the UCLA Gender Studies Department, and the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies for helping us spread the word about this conference to their networks. So Professor Karagosian, I'd now like to turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for your kind introduction, Megan, and greetings to you all. As Megan indicated, my name is Professor Anne Karagosian, and it is my pleasure and privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to join the Zorian Institute in welcoming you to our first joint event, an important webinar conference on the subject of gender and intersectionality in post-Soviet Armenia. The tiny Republic of Armenia, established barely 30 years ago after emerging from over 70 years as a Soviet republic, has seen extraordinary tumult and challenge, as well as inspiring transformation and development in so many different sectors of life. As we saw in the past year and a half, however, with the crises triggered by the COVID pandemic, and of course, the war over Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, the challenges are increasing at an alarming rate, requiring the absolute best and brightest of Armenia's population to be fully engaged in the country's problem solving and in the development of solutions and opportunity for societal advancement. Hence, it is exceptionally important to explore in a frank and objective and open manner Armenia's challenges in reaching its great potential. As we will hear today, some of Armenia's longstanding societal challenges, extending in some cases from the period of the Armenian genocide and before, have been in the area of gender roles and opportunities. It is thus imperative for us to explore these issues frankly, to understand their history and implications for the past and the present, and to proactively discuss ways in which addressing gender-related issues can have a positive impact on the present-day Republic of Armenia and Armenians. Before I turn the webinar over to my colleagues, I'd like to offer my own special thanks to our UCLA Promise Institute colleague, Dr. Melissa Bilal, for coordinating and working so effectively with the team at the Zorian Institute in putting together this very important and impressive conference. So thank you for your dedication to this event, Melissa, and now I will turn things back over to Megan.
Thank you very much. So I would now like to introduce our first panel chair of the day, Professor Melissa Bilal. Dr. Bilal is a lecturer in the Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA and serves in the core team developing the American University of Armenia's Gender Studies program. Professor Bilal's research and publications focus on Turkey's minority and memory politics and the Armenian experience. She is currently collaborating with Lerna Ekmekcilu on the book and digital humanities project, Feminism in Armenian, A History in Documents. And as I already mentioned, Professor Bilal was instrumental in the conceptualization and execution of this conference, and we are so pleased to welcome her today as panel one chair for the first panel, Armenia's Gender Trouble, Deconstructing Anti-Genderism from Historical, Linguistic, and Sociocultural Anthropological Perspectives. Professor Bilal, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Megan and Anne. Welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of this conference dedicated to gender and intersectionality in Armenia. I thank the organizers, especially Megan Reid, and the participants, the panelists and the audience for creating this platform to discuss some of the major gender-related issues in Armenia and beyond. This first panel is an introduction to the rest of the conference, if you like, and it hosts 4 scholars who, through their research, will help us develop a transdisciplinary approach to the anti-gender, anti-feminist discourse in Armenia, which is crucial to unlock some of the most important issues this conference will tackle in these 2 days. So as Megan said, the title of this panel is Armenia's Gender Trouble, reference to Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, deconstructing anti-genderism from historical, linguistic, and socio-cultural anthropological perspectives. So we have 4 scholars. I will read their bios first and then turn the floor to them. So our first panelist is Sevan Bukyan, who currently works as equity lead on gender and intersectionality in public policy and community engagement in the public sector in Edmonton. Sevan completed a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta and an MA in political studies from the American University of Beirut. Her experience has spanned over a decade in teaching, research, and policy work in non-Western feminist and queer theory, intersectionality, critical race theory, anti-racism, memory, trauma-informed approach, and an anti-oppressive and anti-colonial frameworks with a strong commitment to reconciliation. Her current research focuses on the way trauma and memory shape national identity discourses through gendered intersectionality and post-colonial analysis of identity, recognition, and reconciliation. I will not read Sevan's land recognition, but Megan already read our conference's land recognition. Though I read recently that it's also problematic, but we can discuss it another time. Our second panelist is Tamar Shirinyan. Professor Tamar Shirinyan is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She's a cultural anthropologist invested in the wide areas of gender theory and studies, transnational feminisms, political economy, the process of post-socialism, psychoanalysis, and more recently, medical and psychological anthropology. Professor Shirinyan's latest book project, Survival of a Perverse Nation, Queer Transformations in Post-Socialist Armenia, investigates the intersections of political economy, gender, and sexuality in the post-socialist Republic of Armenia. And I want to acknowledge that Tamar is also part of FEMARC, the Feminist Armenian Research Collective that Lernak Mekciola and I started, as Megan read, and you are all welcome to join FEMARC. We will have more workshops, and Tamar was our workshop participant 2 years ago. So the next panelist is Rafik Santrosyan, my colleague at AUA. Rafik Santrosyan received his PhD in German linguistics from Yerevan State Linguistic University in 2015. He has served as a lecturer at Yerevan State Linguistic University, American University of Armenia, and as a visiting professor at the Stanford School of Public Policy, University of Duke, and a postdoctoral fellow at City College, International Faculty of the University of Sheffield, Greece. He worked as a research fellow at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, Center for Women's and Gender Studies of the University of Paris 8, France, at the University of Padova, Italy. Rafik is the most international among all of us. Santrosyan's teaching and research interests lie in the fields of gender linguistics, multimodal semiotics, and simultaneous interpreting. His current research examines the interconnectedness of grammatical gender and language-mediated cultural discriminatory practices. I'm really happy that Rafik is on this panel because linguistic is further away from my expertise, but I enjoyed and benefited from his research in my teaching at AUA. And our last panelist is our dear Anna Alektanyan. Alektanyan is a PhD candidate at the Stressler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, another FEMARC member. Her dissertation explores gendered aspects of the Armenian genocide in the experiences of its female victims. Before starting her PhD, Anna worked at the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute as a researcher for 7 years. She received her BA and MA in history at Yerevan State University. She is currently an adjunct lecturer at the American University of Armenia. What a lineup. Without further ado, I am passing the baton to Sevan. Dear Sevan, Sevan's title is Collective Trauma, National Anxiety, and Gender Politics, Rethinking Armenian National Identity. What a great title to start this whole day and the conference with. Thank you very much, Sevan, for being here. And the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Melissa. That's a great introduction. And yeah, I'm very happy to be in this panel with everyone and share it and, you know, have this discussion later when we have the Q&A portion as well. So yeah, I want to, you know, I do the acknowledgements. So I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Edmonton, and this is specifically the Papas Chase Cree First Nation territory and the traditional Treaty 6 territory and the traditional Métis Homeland Region 4. So I want to acknowledge that that's where I'm speaking from and currently, you know, working in as well. So the presentation that I have for the next 15 minutes is basically kind of a reflection of part of the work that I've been doing in the past years and trying to kind of understand a little bit of, you know, disciplinary approaches and, you know, even kind of thinking through how, you know, anti-genderism functions in the disciplinary context and the theoretical disciplinary context as well. And also link it to, you know, the kind of questions that interested me over time and why I'm looking at it this way as well. So, you know, when we think of anti-genderism in the context of post-Soviet Armenia, you know, we can't really sort of, you know, approach it without first looking at it in its global context and regional context as well. So it's not something particular to Armenia. Anti-genderism is something that we're witnessing globally in very similar ways sometimes, similar languages, similar violence, similar forms of oppression, similar forms of silencing. And so this is something that we have to also acknowledge and understand then how is it happening in Armenia specifically? Like, what are the particularities of that case? So this is targeting, you know, women's rights, LGBTQ plus populations, 2S plus as well in the Canadian context, and others. So these are some things that are often happen in the name of nationalism, patriotism, the conservation of family, traditional values. And it seems like it's a repeated kind of context, like it's a formula that comes through in various contexts, really, specifically targeting, again, you know, marginalized communities, but in this context, you know, women and LGBTQ plus and gender non-binary folks. So my work has been kind of obviously to challenge the national identity narrative that's, you know, often expressed, even in the case of Armenia, in this heroic struggles, you know, the glorified, you know, military context, the glorified male victories or male-based kind of, you know, narrative of victories, the silencing of women and LGBTQ plus populations and voices and experiences. So making the space really unwelcoming and often violent for their expressions. So what we learn when we look at nation building processes, and that's the question that I started asking. And of course, I come from the tradition of political science. So anthropology is something that I've kind of, you know, learned across time. I'm still learning, obviously, but it's something that's been an intrigue for me because political science did not offer the answers I was looking for to analyze the context of Armenia. So naturally, you know, I was aiming for an interdisciplinary approach to unpack what's going on. And one of the things in nationalist theories is that it's often a very sort of, you know, linear narrative. It's very Eurocentric narrative. And there is a interesting absence of, you know, narrating nation building in the context of narratives of loss, grief, death, and, you know, trauma. So that's where I started to ask those questions around where are those stories, right? And of course, that's problematic in its own way, because we know that, you know, post-colonial struggles and decolonization struggles are also problematic in their own way, in the way in which they also silence various people's voices. And in the case of Armenia, we can see that, yes, it was in some form, to simplify it, a decolonial force in many ways, that a nationalist movement, but that movement was not one to bring in the voices of marginalized populations. It was one to continue that element of nation building in its modernist way, to silence and continue to be hegemonic and continue the heteronormative sort of discourse within it. So those are some of the things that kind of intrigued me and started looking at more closely. And one thing I noticed, though, is that, well, that's a true narrative of Armenian in the Armenian case, but one important factor in the case of Armenia is, where does the history of genocide fall? Because maybe because I'm diaspora Armenian, and the question of genocide is continuously present in our existence and since our birth, really. So how does that play out in the context of post-Soviet Armenia was my main question when I first went to do research in 2011 for this project, for my dissertation and onwards. So that was the beginning of those questions. And I noticed a very interesting discussion that started to take place between the narratives of 1988 movement, linking it to the 1965 first time kind of commemoration of the Armenian genocide, linking it to the context of the Gharapagh War of the 90s, so 92 to 94, and whatever happened in its follow-up, right? So the independence period in Armenia in early stages, you hear a lot of the dark years and the difficulties that people were facing. But initially, those links weren't clear. But when I started to speak to people and I started to read more, even from scholarship that came from the local kind of, context, I noticed those links were kind of consolidated for me. So trauma is part of that nation building narrative in Armenia. It also in many ways becomes part of the way in which those heteronormative discourses become also very much ingrained, because trauma in this context becomes one to address issues of survival, preservation, life, right? So especially of course in the context of Armenia, in its regional fears, in its regional kind of Turkey on one side, Azerbaijan on another, and the complexities of that existence in a pan-Turkic sort of context, if we can put it that way. So the survival ideology is one that comes also very interestingly to me in a very anti-gendered narrative that positions Armenia and in this kind of push and pull between Europe and Russia. We're not Europeans. When I spoke to women, I remember in Gharapagh specifically, where I did some research over the years. I was interested of the question of how do women there, what is the difference really between Armenia and Gharapagh, or what can we kind of conclude in this narrative? And one of the things that stood out quite a lot is that distinction, right? Like, we are not Europeans, we are not also Russians. So that came out through the narrative of women's experiences in locating their own Armenianness. And that's also very, very important to listen to. And I'll get to that point a little later around the problems of addressing anti-genderism through the feminist literature that often also excludes the voices of people from non-Western countries and from specifically decolonial contexts. So there is a problematic aspect as well in the anti-gender kind of struggle that we have by feminists. So, so that interdisciplinary and intersectional perspective in the study of Armenian identity through memory and trauma is also a form of like looking at trauma, looking at gender and queer studies, looking at nationalism studies, and really sort of trying to see the story that comes out of that connection in my research. And what helped me to understand this progression is that if there is a dominant narrative, so to speak, then what is happening outside of those dominant narratives? What's happening in terms of countering those dominant narratives? And that's where I became very interested in the counterpublic spaces, as is often referenced, or counterpublics in the literature. But it's really sort of, I sometimes use the word resilience in my research in that context of counterpublic narratives, to understand, how nationalist discourses are sort of perceived, and what are the ways in which different groups react to it and build their own alternative narratives against that hegemonic construction. And that's the part that I really sort of enjoyed doing, because it opened up this possibility, right? That's what it is. It's a possibility. It's a possibility outside of heteronormative narratives. It's a possibility outside of hegemonic discussions of national unity that continuously silence. So it's kind of a segment of hope, really, when you look at those counterpublic spaces that are not homogeneous, that are not the same, that present diverse narratives, but that also provide us with that possibility of a different future, if you will. So one of the things that perhaps also came through, and I've written a little bit about this as well, is the striking language of anti-genderism in Armenia. Anti-genderism, in terms of this national anxiety, as the title of my presentation also encompasses, it's really how I sort of saw the reflections around the language of homosexuality, the language of feminism, how these kind of groups are labeled. One of the things that stood out to me is the word Turk, right? So it's very strongly sort of comes through in discussing different groups that do not fit the national narrative. There's a very deep connotation to that, and as I mentioned, it's embedded in a sequel, right? In a sequel of, as Marutian says, of course, that's kind of his way of putting it. It's that continuation of the genocide into the Gharapagh nationalist movement, into the wars and the continuation of wars, and the continuation of that necessary military context in many ways. So it becomes this kind of cycle that we get stuck into, and it's perpetuated over and over. And that terminology continuously excludes those who do not fit, who do not conform to that. So that collective national anxiety of the enemy, the external enemy, is really important. It encompasses everybody who's deviant, basically, in quotation marks, to that narrative of conforming. This is, I guess, the part that's always been really intriguing to me in understanding the strength of the terminology. When I heard it, when it came through, this force of externalization. It's not even that you're a foreign, you're the national enemy. That terminology is very, in many ways, violent against these populations, these groups, and that struck me as something that's quite something that we need to be worried about. And obviously there is a context of worry that's clearly being reflected. So that external threat of presenting, homosexuality, presenting feminism, feminist values, perspectives, activism as external to the context, and an external threat as well. So the enemy, but also external to the context, is filtered then through that national anxiety of the existing context of the Gharapagh War and the memory of genocide. So that othering process is then ingrained in that traumatic experience, in that traumatic kind of representation. So that's, I guess, where also the context of the Armenian or anti-genderism in Armenia is kind of highlighted. And those are the links that are important to kind of consider when we're thinking about anti-genderism in the context, especially as we kind of move today to a stage where, since last year, the situation in Armenia has been very difficult, clearly, with a very deep sense of loss, trauma, and impact, and sense of, the notion of survival comes through yet strongly. So those are going to also impact the way in which we're going to see anti-genderism play out. Despite that, of course, the feminist groups and queer groups are doing a lot to kind of challenge those notions and those voices, and they are progressing, but that anti-genderism needs to be highlighted as well. So perhaps, I don't know how much time I have. Am I ending almost, or? 1 more minute. Okay, that's good. Okay, so the way I've been trying to think about it, and this is a new thought, so bear with me in kind of trying to articulate it, is that, you know, the space that I was interested in is this counter memory that engages with this critical rethinking of national identity. As I mentioned, the possibilities of what we can have in the future. So alternative ideas of transformation, really. And, you know, one of it is this notion of critical fabulation that comes from Saidiya Hartman's work that I've been kind of reading a little bit. And this is a newer introduction for me in kind of thinking around these questions, this idea of how we can kind of think around our work. And I think she kind of puts it as this idea of what is kind of missing in the narrative, what is not represented in the narrative, what is silenced in the narrative, and how can that be a transformation for us to think of an alternative, to dream, to imagine that alternative that doesn't yet exist, perhaps. So I'll kind of leave it at that, but I'm happy to, you know, have more opportunities to talk about that point of speculative kind of future as we progress. But thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sevan. Just a great introduction to the entire conference. Now our speaker is Tamar Shirinyan, and her presentation title is Gender Hysteria, the Figure of the Homosexual, National Anxiety, and Armenians' Queer Features.
Okay, I hope that everyone can see the slides. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you also for to the organizers of this conference for the invitation. The title of my presentation today is going to be Gendered Hysteria. So I will use the word gender or gendered throughout interchangeably to kind of point out that there's a very particular notion of the concept of gendered or gender that's being used in the anti-gender movement. On October 15th, 2013, the No to Gender Perversion Initiative, which emerged from the No to Gender Perversion Facebook group, protested gender in a march from the center of Yerevan, Armenia, to the main government building in Republic Square. At the square, Komitas Hovnanian, a prominent member of the Armenian Apostolic Church, gave a speech later aired on the national news network A+1. He stated, "I think that for us, this thing called gendered is the decision of certain persons whose goal it is to pervert the nation. It goes against any kind of morality." Hovnanian used the term gendered to mean homosexuality. He continued, "By promoting the gendered law, we are paving the way for our nation's annihilation. I don't think that any Armenian should allow their daughter or their son to one day enter the church with another woman or man to complete a homosexual marriage. Those gathered here today will have to start in their own families to prevent such possibilities." Hovnanian's speech remobilized the sentiment that the Armenian family was under threat, a sentiment with which the right wing had been playing for a few years already. This time, the culprit was not a particular bar or the owners of a bar, as in the case of DIY, which had to be firebombed and destroyed to save Armenia and Armenian families. Neither was the culprit a gay parade or the screening of a movie about a gay parade that had to be stopped to protect the nation, its children, and its future, as in the 2012 Diversity March or the Parada film screenings, both of which were vehemently attacked. This new culprit was conceptual. Law number 57 regarding the protection of equal rights and opportunities between men and women was passed by the National Assembly on May 20th of 2013. The law made a hotbed of contestation by right-wing nationalists, largely because of its Article 3, which defined gendered, transliterated into the Armenian alphabet, as the acquired, socially fixed behavior of the different sexes, and would use the word and concept of gendered throughout. Protest against the gender equality law produced its own theater of the absurd. Right-wingers organized marches in Yerevan. They used the term gendered as a homosexual slur, or sometimes to mean something like fuck you. They published news stories about Europe's attempt to force all Armenians to become transgender. And they even produced a fairy tale about a little figure named Genderik Oikatik, who was hell-bent on destroying Armenia with a gay pride parade with the help of a European spy. Most commentators have pointed out that protest and discontent surrounding the law was established either on sexism or opposition to equality between men and women, or ignorance of the real meaning of gender. Yet others have maintained that the anti-gender movement that came out of the law's passing was orchestrated, not only locally, but also transnationally, as Dr. Bukyan just pointed out, especially as we see anti-genderism rising across Eastern and Western Europe at around the same time, and is now also becoming a part of right-wing ideology in the US under the headline of gender ideology. While these right-wing politicizations of gender might be orchestrated, today I suggest that they are neither established on formulaic sexism, nor are they based in an ignorance of the concept of what gender means. In September 2013, journalist Samson Martirosyan reported on this frenzied debate in the Armenian Weekly, referring to it as hysteria. While Martirosyan uses the term hysteria colloquially, meaning something like an exaggerated emotional outburst, we might also read the panic surrounding the law, as well as the larger anti-gender movement that accompanied it, through the psychoanalytic and especially Lacanian conceptualization of hysteria. In this regard, I suggest that right-wing nationalists are not ignorant about gender, but that rather they get it right, and that having gotten it right, they start to freak out. As feminists or queers, we might take some important lessons from what right-wing nationalists think about gender. In 2013, they seem to have hit on a critical queer feminist knowledge. The concept of gender has radical potential. In their world, it is dystopian potential. In ours, it might be utopian. So bear with me. During the gender hysteria of 2013, Tigran Kocharyan, known for his nationalist blogging and also rumored to be working for the KGB, commented on public policy that allowed for EU ascension and which had horrifically perverse consequences. As he wrote in his blog, generally, there are a series of laws which are required for those who will be members of Europe. Ukraine and Moldova are within this process right now. I follow it very carefully. Based on those laws, we will have a society without males and females and without families. For example, one draft for a law is about to put into circulation, through its details, allows childcare centers to kidnap children from their parents. This is not my anti-European propaganda or pro-Russian or whatever else. This is a very serious danger. We already have a law giving power to sex's reproduction: man, woman, transgender, non-gender, bigender, etc. So man now decides for himself what social sex he has. This is a topic that needs to be seriously considered by professionals, lawyers, cultural experts. Our church definitely needs to present its opinion. We need to understand what is being tied around our necks. This is going to be a long war. This statement offers an important beginning in our quest to uncover the causes, or as Freud would suggest, an etiology of gender hysteria. Kocharyan's understanding of gender is quite close to various Western feminist renderings of gender, or temperament in Margaret Mead's sense prior to the conceptualization of the sex-gender binary. Kocharyan recognizes that if sex and gender are different, then the existence of two sexes does not hinder the existence or reproduction of more than two genders. In this sense, his anxiety stems not from an ignorance of what gender really means, but a deep familiarity with what gender means, as well as the repercussions of this meaning. I'm gonna stop screen share now. In Gender Trouble, Judith Butler insists on a radical splitting of the gendered subject, which would misplace gender from the binarization tendency of sex. Sex, then, which is taken up to mean male and female, always two and opposing, would be split from gender, opening up the possibility of a multiplicity of meanings, not necessarily tied down to the binary male-female, nor forcing a natural flow from one to the other. Thus, gender becomes a free-floating artifice with the consequences that man and masculine might just as easily signify a female body as a male one, and woman and feminine a male body as easily as a female one, she writes. However, splitting gender from sex also raises the question of the nature of sex itself. Is sex really a natural, fixed, and predetermined category, or is it also cultural, shifting? If the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. Thus, not biology, but culture becomes destiny. Since the move to name woman, man as culture rather than biology does not shift the possibilities of meaning, but reinforces the binarized possibilities that already come from sex. Butler furthers this notion in her later book, Bodies That Matter, by arguing that sex is not biological raw material, which is given meaning by gender, but that we are able to see sex in itself as binary, means that gender's regime of truth is already at work. Gender precedes sex, not the other way around. The notion that Butler is refusing in her body of work, that gender and sex are essentially the same thing with the slight difference that one term points to the body while the other points to the social meanings of that body, is precisely the notion of gender required to dismiss the 2013 gender hysteria as a display of ignorance. The concept of gender, if we are to take it seriously, however, does produce radical possibilities, just as right-wing nationalists are suggesting. It is in this way that the term hysteria is apt to describe the pushback against the gender equality law. The hysteria was brought on by the category of gender, which splits the subject from a whole sexed being to a sexed and gendered being, whose gender may align variously and indeterminately to their sex. This is a profound knowledge, one that unearths an unknowable reality beyond what is said to be reality. The realization that the main forms of kinds of subjects that figure all other kinds of splits into binaries, nature, culture, human, non-human, XY chromosome, penis, vagina, production, reproduction, private, public, active, passive, and so on, is not quite a real reality, but a manufactured one, an arbitrary one, or a function of power, can be maddening. This position of discourse calling to question truth and power figures that of the hysteric within Lacan's four discourses. For Lacan, the hysteric holds a special place in relation to knowledge because the hysteric is the only one who can question the master, and this the hysteric does endlessly, marking hers a discourse of constant questioning, the key to science and ultimate truth. The master's discourse for Lacan is marked by a kind of talk that acts as if it had absolute knowledge, and the hysteric brings that supposed absolute knowledge into question, threatening the very possibility of absolute knowledge or truth. I am suggesting that the passionate and frenzied discontent with which Kocharian, Komitas Hovnanian, and other right-wing nationalists in Armenia approach gender marks their discourse as hysterical, not because they are irrational, ignorant, or exaggerating emotion, but because they are absolutely correct and, as a result, absolutely terrified. Nationalist activists, politicians, and journalists pushed back, aiming to hide once again the horrifying reality that they had chanced upon, that there is some kind of split, a rupture in the reality that they had, until that point, taken as the only reality. If sex and gender are split, that would mean there is some kind of truth other than the fact that sex is natural and that all social behavior and the law of the father, what we might call tradition, may be false, or even just part of the story, the superficial story of the ego rather than the real. This suggestion has consequences of which the discourse of the hysterics seem to be aware. If one accepts gender as a true category, what happens to the absolute social laws of family, nation, and God, the one true path of a moral society, or what many right-wing nationalists refer to as what is just right, jisht? When sex is split into gender, its naturalization is revealed as the fantasy of a certain kind of order, namely the patriarchal order. If male is no longer necessarily man and female is no longer necessarily woman, then desire of male is no longer necessarily oriented toward female, and so on. If these things are no longer true, a lot of other things based on these imaginary realities are also not true. Sex splitting into gender does not just open up possibilities of sex roles, like women doing what men traditionally do and so on. That would mean continuing to contain the narrative of gender with binarized biological and social sex as one. A more queer and feminist reading of gender, however, does something else, and this right-wing nationalists seem to understand quite well. Gender reproduces, in Kocharyan's terms, into various and innumerable forms of being. Social roles of males and females no longer flow naturally from their sex, but may go anywhere and everywhere. What gender does is create a radically alternative structure, or uncovers one that was always there, that denounces the heterosexual matrix and thus obligatory heterosexuality altogether. The splitting of sex into sex gender, which disorganizes any possible symbolic container of such knowledges like the heterosexual matrix, and which leads to an infinite number of possibilities for gender, would then make possible an even more infinite, if this were viable, sexual practices and desires. Or to be more precise, the split uncovers knowledge of such a possibility existing, which always existed, which had been suppressed by cultural and social norms, by the master's discourse, by the law of the father, or by patriarchal power. In this sense, it is not hard to understand why this was the cause of such intense displays of hysterical reaction. Prior to law, prior to language, prior to all forms of social ordering, there could have been so many other ways of doing sex, of having sex, of desiring, or of being in the world. And these other ways are still available, always lurking in knowledge. And they cannot be undone, but only denied, refused, or shirked off. Ironically, while liberal feminists and others in Armenia are happy to live with a much less radical notion of gender, it is right-wing nationalists who chanced upon this discovery, and instead of shirking it off, they speak it incessantly, constantly, vigorously through a disavowal. Rather than conceal this knowledge, in other words, they continue to produce it into discourse. It is this radical discourse of great possibilities that we might learn from right-wing nationalists. They might not know it, but they are raising consciousness toward a gender revolution and the dismantling of gender as we know it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar, for that wonderful talk. And I love how already we started, how the papers are following up on each other with theoretical, like feminist and queer theory threads and research, and really like unlocking, also building some analytical kind of perspective and knowledge here. And on that note, now I'm passing the baton to Rafik to talk about gender more. Sorry, Rafik, let me read the title of your presentation. Multimodal meaning making of gender or gender, its impact for policy considerations.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I think my presentation is going to be a bit different from what you probably expect from a linguist. I'm going to look at how gendered meaning is constructed in the Armenian context, and I'm going to provide a couple of hints as to how a deeper understanding of this construction of gendered meaning in the Armenian context could be useful in future policy framework development, again, not only in the Armenian context, but also for other languages. So if we were to talk about language and gender, we would be able to single out three very broad veins of scholarship when it goes to this crossroads between language and gender. The first one would be genderlects, basically the assumption that, sorry, I have to remove this, the assumption that there are actually different styles of language use based on one's gender. There is women's talk, there is men's talk. Research in this area has been conducted for a few decades now. The next main vein of language and gender is gender representation, scholarship that looks into how language expresses the sociocultural concept of gender. And then the third, one of the most interesting and latent areas of gender linguistic research is grammatical gender. Grammatical gender being the arbitrary attribution of gender to such parts of speech as, for example, the noun, right? English has lost this grammatical category for the noun historically. Before the 14th century, it was gone, but English has retained a pronominal gender. In other words, we have he and she in English, while Armenian, as a related Indo-European language, is completely bereft of this grammatical gender. We do not have he or she, we have one na, an, in both varieties of Armenian that, actually stands for both genders, if I were to use the word both. So, gender divisive language has been a matter of discussion recently, of course, in many parts of the world, as Professor Bukyan has already alluded to, in different parts of the world, especially in countries where highly gendered languages are spoken, for example, Greek, Italian, Russian, German. There is an emphasized now attention towards neutralizing, gender divisive language. European Parliament recently adopted a multilingual kind of, set of guidelines for improving gender neutral language that allegedly, quote, reduces gender stereotyping, promotes social change, and contributes to achieving gender equality. Yes, this discussion has been, furthered into looking at what ways, in what ways we could actually neutralize these gendered languages for languages that have the so-called natural gender. And I do not understand what this is, supposed to mean, truth be told. These guidelines, stipulate that for languages that have this binarized gender, as English, for example, we could reduce the use of gendered words. In other words, we could, change spokesman to spokesperson, policeman. English is quite, in English we have quite many such words. There are languages that have a nominal grammatical gender. In other words, nouns being feminine, masculine, or neuter, where this grammatical category agrees or is governed by a number of other linguistic functions, right? And sometimes the guidelines here stipulate that neutralizing these languages grammatically would be impossible. In such cases, feminization is offered as gender as a form of gender inclusive discourse. In other words, replacing generic masculines with double forms, as can be seen in the example. We have something similar in English. Instead of using the generic he, some English speakers opt for he or she, and so on and so forth. I do not want to elaborate on this a lot, because I just wanted to contextualize us in terms of where, language comes in aside, from being that main tool of communicating meanings. We could see that up to this point, language has been considered as this main meaning-making resource that is available to us as humans in constructing and then communicating meaning, right? With this presentation, I would like to contest that meaning making and representation monopoly of language. And I want to show the underlying structural aspects of gender and their intentional or unintentional multimodal reproduction in the Armenian context. That way, I will be able to argue that the construction of this gendered meaning across modes and media is based on the notion of agency. So let me proceed. To continue with the thought of Armenian being gender neutral from a very grammatical perspective, we'll have to explore the language further. Up until 1915, there was a common misunderstanding in linguistics that most Indo-European languages had this grammatical category of gender, and English has lost it, for example, for the noun, and a few other languages, Armenian and Indo-Iranian, lost this category in their historical development. However, in 1915, a language is deciphered, the language of the Hittites, which proves to be the oldest attestable Indo-European language, and this oldest attestable Indo-European language categorizes nouns just like the Armenian language does it today, based on the concepts of animacy and inanimacy. This gives us a thought that most probably Armenian never actually developed this category. But now, having entirely grammatically neutral, genderless, or in linguistic parlance, epicene language doesn't mean that the language is not androcentric per se. So Armenia, in the Armenian language, gender is marked in a few ways. Lexically, we have words that embed the meaning of maleness and femaleness, similar to English, of course. In this regard, this is what the guidelines that I mentioned refer to as languages with natural gender. So we have duster, vorti, we have amusin, kin, tin, tramart, and so on and so forth. Words that in their semantics embed the meaning of maleness and femaleness. We express gender morphologically as well by introducing a feminizing a morpheme, a feminizing element, right? We have ashakert, ashakertuhi, usano, usano uhi, and so on and so forth. So this uhi is a feminizing a postfix that is added to allegedly gender neutral words. And then we also express, just like in certain cases in English, analytically by introducing a feminizing word to gender neutral vocabulary. Now, the Armenian language seems to be gender neutral grammatically. But is it the case with the language use? So to understand this, I conducted an experimental word association survey where respondents were asked to associate their understanding of the words that were given. The first part of the survey asked respondents to identify whether the noun that is provided to them is male, female, both, or whether they're unsure. So it was fascinating to see that all the words that implied a very high degree of agency or agency at all were associated predominantly with maleness. All the words that denoted secondary forms of agency, ancillary positions, or no agency at all, they were associated with femaleness. A couple of examples I would like to single out before I move on. So person, for example, anhat in the Armenian language is, of course, predominantly associated with both genders, but what's astounding to me here is this drastic difference between, the male and female answers. Representative nergayatsutsich in 179 cases was associated with maleness because it implies a high degree of agency. Police officer, minister, predominantly the numbers here are really telling. It's fascinating that there were a couple of words, the Armenian word for hall, pornik, and secretary, kardugar, that have their highly common feminized versions with uhi, were again associated with femaleness. Look at the difference here: 22 a male and 473 femaleness. Although linguistically speaking, the form that they were provided with was the male version of it, without the feminizing postfix. So at this stage, one might think these are words out of context. These are words in isolation. What about words in context? And the second part of the survey accounted for that. And here I provided respondents with sentences with extended contexts in the Armenian language, of course, and respondents were asked to again associate the subject of the sentence with maleness, femaleness, both, or if they were unsure, they would say they were unsure. So the first sentence is really noteworthy here. After working as a mayor for many years, this person, na, epicene pronoun in Armenia, decided to concede the position to the younger generation. And here we can see a very high degree of agency, and therefore it was associated in 568 cases with maleness. Compare this with the second sentence. To everyone's great surprise, this person, this epicene pronoun, was nominated for the next elections. This is probably the only case where I have two equally distributed numbers, 220, 220. And the assumption is that this first clause of the sentence, to everyone's great surprise, determined this, because otherwise, if it, weren't surprising, why would it be associated with femaleness? The company delegated their best professional, of course, 205 people associated with maleness. I wouldn't like to spend too much time on this, just to conclude that in the Armenian linguocultural context, of course, there is this equation between the social plane and the physiological binarized plane of gender, understanding, as Professor Shirinyan very nicely landscape for us. This understanding of masculinity equated to maleness is characterized, is constructed around the axis of agency. The only two forms of female agency that the Armenian language and linguocultural reality in general recognizes for the female are sexual agency, which culturally is portrayed as a negative, of course, feature, as is the case with most patriarchal, if not all patriarchal contexts, and reproductive agency, motherhood, that is, looked at as, of course, the positive, aspect, especially nowadays after the recent war, where women are, through different discursive mechanisms, encouraged to mother future young combatant males. So the assumption is that, yes, the Armenian language is gender neutral. It is gender neutral from a grammatical perspective. And this gender neutrality seems to be that space where one wonders how this gendered use comes about. What meaning-making processes feed this highly gendered use of the language? And, I have a couple of examples. I'm not sure whether I will manage to go through all the examples I have in this presentation, but to use this, just an example. An analysis of Armenian advertising campaigns on, public TVs, most common, TV channels, shows two aspects of, portrayals of women, either hypersexualized or portrayed as mothers. But I have this very example over here. By the way, the writing was in Armenian. I translated it verbatim into English so that we can read. Just to illustrate what multimodality, as the social semiotic approach tries to unveil. What multimodality multimodal discourse analysis from a social semiotic perspective wants to do is to understand what sociocultural resources we have at hand in order to make meaning, right? Besides language. Language is not the only, tool of meaning making. So here we have the image. Of course, the image can further be broken down to lighting, emphasis, colors, etc., etc. And then we have a correlation between this image, the background, the gift box, the hair color of the person depicted, the smile, the eye contact, the positioning of the image, and so on and so forth. I would like to draw your attention on the text. In Armenian, it was double. The Armenian language generally doesn't have the word double in such, discursive use, but for some reason the text maker, the author of this very advertising campaign, opted for that word and reduplicated this word, double. Now notice how a meaning is constructed thanks to the proximity of this writing with the exposed bosom of the person depicted. Double. Wing, 2 times. Notice also why, 2 times is written in digits and not, in writing in general, I mean, in alphabet. And the continuation of this campaign, double your winnings. Question arises here as to who wins what. What multimodal, analysis would allow us to do is to constantly ask, questions as to why. Why 2 people? Why this? Why that? This is an allusion, of course. The woman portrayed is an allusion to Dunanush in the Armenian context. If you have the post-Soviet, cultural background, you definitely know that Santa, Dzmerpap, or Ded Moroz, as it is in Russian, comes with his granddaughter. So here we have a woman who, is that allusion to, Santa's granddaughter, and the writing double, 2 Santas. And then a multimodal analysis further looks at, the eye directions, but let's remove one of these. So double.
Rafik, I'm so sorry to interrupt. You are for 5 minutes.
Okay, just to conclude.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm very sorry. 1 minute. I'm very sorry. I get carried away. I know. Thank you so much. So to conclude, I'm going to show you all of this, portrayals, hypersexualized women, portrayals of men, discourse, stories in textbooks that, talk about, women a certain way, depict women, represent women a certain way, and men a certain way. The recent, currency depicting men, and certain men, of course, acknowledging men's individual deeds, etc. So what I suggest with this presentation is that we should not, we should not concentrate on language as the main source of gendered meaning making, because, the case of Armenian as an entirely gender neutral language shows that, there are other meaning making processes that feed this gendered meaning construction. We should instead look for many other layers of culturally available sources that contribute to this gendered meaning. School textbooks, for example, television, urban space, and social media and language and discourse in general. I hope, I'm very sorry for getting carried away. I hope I communicated my main message. If I didn't, my email was there. Feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Rafik. Actually, we will have time during Q&A if you want to go back to the part, your wonderful slides that we couldn't discuss, you couldn't discuss more, we can go back to them. And this also gives me the idea that we should invite you for a standalone lecture, because all this, I've learned a lot from the linguistic aspect to cultural and policy making. So now our last panelist is Anna Alektanyan, and I really love how we are also showcasing gender-related research in and on Armenia and beyond, and everything is so connected. And we're also coming up with recommendations for policy and pedagogy and also scholarship. So Anna Alektanyan's title is The Transformation of Discourses About Traditional Armenian Family and Its Political Manipulation.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everyone. It is great to be here among these great scholars and to present here in this platform. Today, I'm going to speak about the concept of traditional Armenian family and the discourses around this concept and how this became a source for manipulation for different Armenian political leaders. To do that, I will start with the interview which took place in June 2nd in 2017. The First Lady of Armenia, Rita Sarkisyan, she was invited to the opening of the hospital that she and her charity organization was part of it to finance it, and she was invited in that opening. And the journalist asked her about the elections in the next year and asked her about her opinion. If she is okay that her husband is going to be prime minister, be elected prime minister of Armenia. So to answer that, she said, if you're asking my opinion, in the first place, I didn't want him to be a politician, to become a president at all. But, and then the journalist asked the second question. Would you give an advice to your husband to not become a prime minister in these coming elections? Then she was very surprised. She said, why you are asking me this question? How you can ask such questions? How can I give an advice? I do not like all those women, all those ladies who can give an advice to their husbands. I could never do that. And I'm against them, I'm against these women, and I would never give an advice to my husband. And if he would, and I would never respect a man who can listen to my advice. So this was a very shocking from one point, but from the other point, this is, I'm going to come back to this, why Rita Sarkisyan was responding to that in this way, to that question in this way. After the revolution, Anna Hagopian, the wife of the new prime minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan's wife, came to visit, came to the US. She visited different Armenian communities in the US, and there was a meeting with her at MIT where Armenian students had an opportunity to ask questions, and I was among the students, and I asked her a question about her role in the revolution and how she was supporting her husband during the revolution, standing next to him and being present there supporting. And in my surprise, she was very protective, and she said that it was not her, it was all her husband. She was just there. She was just doing her wife's role, and she even denied the fact that throughout all the political career of Nikol Pashinyan, she was next to him. She, at that very moment, she forgot that she was the chief editor of one of the leading newspapers in Armenia, the opposite newspapers in Armenia, and she was the active member of civil society in Armenia. So at that very moment, she denied all that. And next sentence was, I am an Armenian woman who has a traditional Armenian family. And I was surprised that she also refers to this, and she also brings up being a member of traditional Armenian family and being this traditional Armenian wife, denying the fact that she was a very active political figure, and she still is. So so then my question is, and the question in general is, so what is this traditional Armenian family, and why all Armenian political leaders refer to that, and some Armenian political leaders, such as Robert Kocharyan, Serge Sarkisyan, and then even Nikol Pashinyan refer to that, saying that they came to protect the most important value of the Armenian society, which is traditional Armenian family. And if you ask this question to ordinary people, what is the traditional Armenian family? You will hear like different answers that suits this very person. So there is no such a concept, no such a thing that no one will give you an answer. So what is this traditional Armenian family? So, and this happened right after the revolution, when many Armenian women who were very active members of Armenian civil society and this movement, they were the very reason of this peaceful revolution. They were the very reason that Armenia could make that step, could overcome all this regime, and could peacefully make possible this transfer of the power in Armenia. So to answer to this question, I went back to the Armenian to see what Armenian political leaders publicly were saying, and in which context they were referring to the traditional Armenian family. For example, in 1998, when Robert Kocharyan came to the power, the main slogan of his campaign was that my party is my Armenian nation. So my party, he is the father of that party, and Armenian nation somehow is a family. So one party, one man, and one family. And he's the father who will take care of that family. And then after Robert Kocharyan, Serge Sarkisyan comes with the same notion, saying that he is the only preserver. His party, also the Republican Party, is the guarantee that we will preserve the traditional Armenian family, the most important value to preserve our society, to preserve Armenian nation. And even if you will go and open Republican Party webpage, you will find out the program of this party, and they actually included the sentences about preserving these traditional Armenian families in this in their election program. So, but what again? What is this traditional Armenian family? If we have to, if we want the answer, we have to go back to the early 19th century or mid 19th century, when first Armenian intellectuals tried to find out how Armenians were living in the cities or in the rural areas, both in the Ottoman Empire or also in the Persian Empire, and then it became the Russian Empire, and to find out the evil of so-called traditional Armenian family system, which was this so-called Nahabidagan Armenian family. So what was this Nahabidagan Armenian family? Nahabidagan Armenian family was a structure when every member of the family had to play a role. No one in that family had a right to question the head of the family, which was the father, the Nahabed. And next to Nahabed was a grandmother, his wife, who would take care that every member of the family would basically play their role. And in this family structure, there was no, and no one had any rights. Nothing can be said about the rights of the bride or the husband or the children. No, it was only about, this structure was only about the roles that they had to play. And also, the grandmother should have followed that they would, in that structure, they would follow the strictest rules, and no one will break the rule. No one will break this this concept of this this family concept. So an Armenian family, this structure of Armenian traditional Armenian family, as I said, survived centuries. And it has different reasons why it survived, but it survived till the mid-19th century. And in the mid-19th century, it started to change because of different changes, because Eastern Armenia became part of Russian Empire, and it brought its own changes. And also Armenian intellectuals tried to find out why Armenians having these troubles that they were having. And many Armenian intellectuals tried to find these problems of Armenian nation within a very within side of this traditional Armenian family and the concept of this family. So first anthropologists, first ethnographers who traveled to the villages, they tried to publish, to write about these families. They tried to raise awareness that this concept should be changed. And this was the time when Armenian intellectuals tried to publish and tried to actually offer new concepts for the Armenian family. So they were criticizing the old model. They were criticizing this Nahabidagan model, where there were no rights. There were nothing about the rights. No one had any rights. And they were trying to give a new model to Armenian family, which will survive in the new world, in their understanding. And it included, of course, the right of education for women, they were trying to break the system of Munchk, which didn't allow women to speak until they became grandmother, and they were trying to make possible for these Nahabidagan Armenian family members to have a right to leave that big house and to live in a small house, and to have a not 40-50 members, living with 40-50 members, but living with a small family model. But again, there was a question about how it was possible to organize because in 19th century, bandaghtutun was a crucial part of the Armenian family. Many Armenian men were traveling abroad to work for their families. They were not coming back. Most of them were not sending money back home. And to keep this image of the family, the Armenians had to go back to this traditional Armenian family structure where you do not have a right to complain. If you would complain, you're gonna be punished. So it is not good thing to complain. So, and this was late 19th century, early 20th century, in the discourses of Armenian intellectuals and decision makers. And as you know, during the Armenian genocide, especially in Western Armenia, the entire Armenian family system was destroyed. And it was the moment when also Armenian women, some Armenian women, took responsibility to make decisions. And that very moment and that very thing helped them to preserve part of Armenian nation and to survive the genocide. But this is another question that is not topic of my presentation today. So when we come to Soviet Armenia, it seems that things change because Soviet brought its own system. And this new Soviet Armenian family structure was organized somehow. But at the same time, we see that hiddenly, or at some places, not that hiddenly, openly, this Nahabidagan structure of Armenian family, where Armenian women didn't have a voice, didn't have rights, didn't have rights to make decisions, especially in the villages. So somehow it was preserved. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union and new in the Republic of Armenia, again, Armenian decision makers tried to refer back to this traditional Armenian family structure. Why? Whenever we speak about women's rights, whenever we speak about the domestic violence, whenever we speak about interfering to this domestic violence, whenever we speak about this legal system to make it possible to protect Armenian women and to protect them and children, not only women, but also children from this domestic violence, the discourse changes into different direction. First 2 days, people are shocked that this woman or that woman or this children or that person became a victim of domestic violence, and the next day they forget about it and they would say that we have to preserve a traditional Armenian family, not even thinking what evil it is and what kind of evil it can be for the Armenian family and for Armenian society today. So why then also political leaders do not want to change this, do not want to make their society more healthy, do not want to prevent this domestic violence, to make Armenian society better. So, and why they are referring to traditional Armenian family, where there were only one leader, a father of the family, who is the only person who can make decisions, and the rest of the family should follow them and should obey, and they do not have any rights to kind of to resist or to raise their voice when it is not going right. So I will conclude here to just leave these questions open, because I think this is something that we have to discuss, and this is a challenge that we have in nowadays Armenia. I just want to add to that any person in Armenia who wants to address to traditional Armenian family and to say that this family structure was evil and is evil and we have to change it, that person faces a very serious kind of resistance, because these political leaders also made sure that they created this image of the Armenian traditional family that is sacred, and those who want to condemn this structure, they are enemies of the nation and they are enemies of Armenia, and it is almost impossible to discuss these kind of questions anywhere, even in academia. So I will just leave it there. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Anna. So now we have time for Q&A. We went over time a little bit, but the research and the discussion that we raised on this panel are crucial for the rest of the conference. And we've already questioned the static understanding of like ahistorical static understandings of gender and family. If you have questions, please type your questions in the Q&A box. We have 15 minutes. I will do my best to read them out loud and address it to the panelists. So the first question comes from Flora Keshkegyan, and it's for Sevan Bükyan. Would you elaborate on the anxiety and trauma narrative by offering a particular example of its functioning? Also, you might find fruitful resources for reworking narrative in my examination of memory and trauma in my book, Redeeming Memories by Flora Keshkegyan, that I've read and used in my research too, which includes analysis of memorative narratives of the Armenian genocide. Sevan, would you like to answer?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I mean, it's a very complex question because it's not about a necessarily particular example. So, I mean, the discussion I offered around the narrative of, you know, how feminists are represented, or those who challenge the kind of, you know, heteronormative constructions of identity and national kind of identity are, you know, targeted with specific labeling of outsiders. But you know, I think there's a larger question around trauma narrative in the national identity that I can kind of think through. You know, trauma as perhaps in our understanding of the Armenian context is this, which is differentiated from the Eurocentric perceptions of trauma as events, and that's really where I'm coming from with this. Is that it's not something that stops or something that ends in a certain period of time and then you can start healing. It's a process that's continuously part of who you are. It's continuously reshaping the national discourse, national narrative, and also really also individually, right? Like if we think of like how our identities are located in our bodies and how our bodies represent that, we are also negotiating those traumatic experiences in our own way. So my interest here would be maybe to kind of expand on this and think of trauma not in the sense of how it's like how it's represented in an instant or in a moment, but really also how we can think of trauma as a problem in some sense, that it's kind of, becoming creating a cycle of repetition around militarized discourses, around gender roles, and prohibiting forms of transformative politics, even options. And I was thinking a little bit around that kind of thought, so I can offer it now that that I have a little bit of a floor for that. The point around this transformation, I think there is a pleasure. There is a pleasure for me in speculative future. There is a possibility of imagination outside of the bounds of oppression, and how trauma continuously reaffirms its oppressive kind of politics of identity. The forced silencing, as I think everybody here on the panel mentioned and talked about very, very interestingly. So this panel has been great to emphasize that point, that we need to get out of that cycle. And I think trauma has been, and my research has focused on those spaces where trauma is used as a transformation political option to provide us a moment of imagination. Like, this is tiring, right? So if we think of it as in political terms, in activism, in academia, even, as Anna was saying, right? There's tensions in academia around these things. So that is a moment of transformation for me. So I take pleasure in that, and I take pleasure in possibilities. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sevan. And maybe to further this discussion, also because you brought it up already, to really advance research, comparative research between native indigenous studies, like native women and Armenian women, from the perspective of trauma and colonization, and in a way to show, you all mentioned that, but we will discuss more on this topic, the last panel, how trauma, how the perpetrator, how the war and trauma is actually turning against us, and furthers our traumas by militarizing our society and societies, and basically further breaking, basically by not working through these the violence against women and LGBT communities and others that don't fit into that heteronormative, patriarchal, militarized notion of actually power, elitist notion of the people. You're basically furthering that trauma. You're finishing the work that what the perpetrator couldn't finish. And this is very well kind of discussed in indigenous studies and the native women's discourses and their relationship with feminism, first rejecting and then understanding the need for feminism for furthering native, for basically working through our traumas. And in that sense, Anna's work is essential because it also provides us with historical perspective on how, we need that working through the trauma of the genocide and the war is a part of feminist scholarship. So another question is for Tamar. It's by Elisa Matias. I found your paper intellectually inspiring and am left with this question: how do you suppose we reckon the radical possibilities in right-wing discourses with the immediate harm they cause in this moment?
Yeah, I really like that question because it brings what I'm trying to do and trying to say back into the plane of the political, which I think is very different from the theoretical. And I want to pose the question that you're asking, Alyssa, in another way, which is that what is dangerous about kind of not pushing back against notions that the right wing, throws at us. And this is true, I think, in every context. It's not just in Armenia, but in every context. I believe in a kind of struggle that's dialectical. I believe in history that's dialectical. And I think that what tends to happen historically when the left gives up on certain ideas in order to be more accommodating to the right, is that we become more right, and history keeps getting pushed more right. I mean, when we look at the massive kind of authoritarian regimes that have sprung up around the world in the last decade, it's definitely a result of this kind of not pushing back against the rights, but actually just kind of saying, no, it's not that. We're actually more like you than you think. And in fact, we are not. And I think we need to hold fort to the fact that we are not more like them. We are actually opposed to them. And we need to reckon with that fact, right? So when they come at us saying, you're saying everyone is gay, everyone is transgender, and I think a more proper response would be, yes, so what? Right? Rather than, no, we're all normal and we're all hetero and everything is fine, except, maybe we should let women work, or maybe, that is swerving, massively swerving right. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. And this, I want to point out, is also the liberal move. It is the liberal move everywhere, and it's becoming more and more of the political. And I think it's very, very dangerous. So I say we stand our ground. Whenever we can, politically, we need to stand our ground and say, no, what I mean by gender is that. If that's also what you understand by it and you find that threatening, then sorry, I am threatening you.
Yeah, totally agree. Great. And the last question we have is, we have two more. Lili Kazarian, thank you all so much for the amazing talks. I have a question for Rafik. First, thanks for the amazing talk. I echo Melissa's idea about having a longer presentation of your work. I would like to hear your opinion on the idea of the interconnectivity between language and culture, particularly in the context of gender in the Armenian reality. In other words, as the Armenian language appears to be gender neutral, one would assume it would have a certain influence on connection with the given community's mentality and views on gender as well, but is clearly not the case, as we know and as you presented. What do you think the reason of this connection might be? Thank you. Lilith is from UCLA, Linguistic Anthropology.
Hello, colleague. So it's a fascinating question, of course, multi-layered. I would like to reiterate the point I was trying to make is that, yes, Armenian is grammatically gender neutral. However, from the perspective of language use, it exhibits identical patterns of gender, grammatical gender, and language's sexist use as any other patriarchal language. So the concept of gender is built around this notion of agency. But for Lilith, when I heard the question, what came to my mind is a confession that our ancestors made in the 6th century during the Grecophile school of thought. And the confession was the introduction of pronominal gender into Armenian. As a result of translating a lot from the Greek language, our Grecophile philosophers, scholars, translators decided that the Armenian language was inferior because it did not have the linguistic visibility for the feminine, for the female. So they introduced in a few translations from Greek, particularly Acharyan refers to Timotheus Kuz's translations, Pope Timothy of Alexandria. And there we have this ne for she, for her, right? Which is a confession that the necessity to introduce a pronominal gender was on the one hand determined by the linguistic invisibility of the female because of the androcentric use of the language. And on the other hand, of course, it had to do with the general, of course, acknowledgement of the superiority of the Greek language as the hegemonic language of the day. This, of course, did not get grafted with the Armenian language. I mean, the female pronoun, ne. And it was revived in the 19th century by Petros Durian, who has, poems where he uses this ne. And then Grigor Vantsian, who was a Tiflis-based Armenian linguist. Unfortunately, he didn't have a long life, but he has a grammar of the Eastern Armenian language where he explicitly criticizes the Armenian language for not being nuanced enough, and for not, and blames Armenians actually quite explicitly, you will be surprised, for not revisiting the Armenian language by conceptualizing, this gendered aspect of it. So on the one hand, we can take pride in saying that Armenian doesn't have the problems that English has today, in the light of the gendered pronouns, pronoun misuse. We have a number of new pronouns, introduced, z, you, and so on and so forth, right? So Armenian doesn't have it, but having no grammatical gender also elevates the importance of cultural understanding of gender, because you have to have cultural cues in context in order to know who it is, about, right? So that's why we have names, very little ambiguity when it goes to male, female names. This binarization of cultural, meaning of gender is highly emphasized if the language doesn't create, explicit ways of expressing this gender. I hope this was, I don't have a better answer, but to just refer to the confession that our Grecophile scholars made back in the day.
I'm sorry to say that we are now running out of time. We have a couple of more questions, but I will leave them to, maybe you can later have email exchanges. And I think these are also Anna's territory. But I would like to end this panel with a note on my research that is also connected to Anna's research. And I'm learning a lot from Anna, that there's also the need to address this anti-feminist, anti-gender discourse from a historical perspective by reminding that Armenian women intellectuals that Anna also was talking about didn't shy away from using the word feminism in 1898. So if we are talking about traditional Armenian history legacy, we should also include the legacy of these Armenian feminists who actually, as Anna said, saved the nation by through the Armenian women's feminist organizations that they built infrastructures for orphans. And we owe, most of us owe our lives to these feminist foremothers, Armenian, who took issue with the traditional family structure, who were for radicalizing feminism. And I will quote Zabel Asadur here, where she says that if you don't ask for more, they will not give you the less. And she's all for radicalizing feminism. Of course, she was, if you read her from today, she will sound traditional, but let's not forget that tradition is change. Something to become traditional, it needs to change. And on that note, I really want to thank all of our panelists, and leave the panel here and leave the words to Megan.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Bilal, for chairing this panel, and for our 4 panelists today. Very thought-provoking conversations and discussions, fantastic. We'll now take a 10-minute break so you can refill your coffee, stretch your legs. You're welcome to put yourself on mute for the panelists here. If you want to rejoin as attendees, that would be great, because we'd love to have you for the next session as well. So our next session at 1 p.m. is Politics and Representation, Uprooting Sexism, Racism, and Homophobia in Education, Decision-Making, and Public Discourse. So we hope to see you soon in 10 minutes. Take care, and thank you so much again. Hi, Victor, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I'm going to change your name here. It's coming up as Hurig.
Right. I think it would be useful.
Yes. Here. There we go. Did it change on your end? Can you see it?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
of
perfect.
course, that's correct. Thank you.
Perfect. No problem. I'm going to take a quick. Do you have everything ready to go?
Yeah, I think everything's fine. Yeah,
Perfect. I'm going to step away for a quick second and I'll be right back.
of course, no problem. Me too then.
Okay, we're going to start coming back now. So if you can hear me, we'll start in a minute here. We'll give everyone just another minute. We are also still waiting on a few panelists to join, so I just have my colleague following up with them. Hopefully everything's okay.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, I'm wondering, just because we've had some difficulty with the panelists' links, I'm just wondering if we have Gohar or Karina in the attendees list. And if so, just maybe raise your hand and I'll move you over as a panelist. I know some people have been coming in as different names. Perfect. Okay. And if you can change your name there, who do we have? Okay, you're coming up as Nona.
It is not, okay.
Oh, hello. I will change the name now. So.
Perfect. Okay, perfect.
Hello.
Hi, Gohar. And do we have Karina?
Yeah.
We're missing Karina, but maybe we'll get started. I'll have my colleague follow up with her. So we'll get started and then hopefully she'll be able to join us. So welcome back and thank you all for joining us for panel 2 of today's conference, Politics and Representation, Uprooting Sexism, Racism, and Homophobia in Education, Decision-Making, and Public Discourse. If you're just joining, my name's Megan and I am the Deputy Executive Director of the Zorian Institute. I have the pleasure of introducing our panel chair today for today's session, Professor Victor Agajanian. Professor Agajanian is a professor of the Department of Sociology and the International Institute at UCLA. He has conducted research on migration, family, and sexual and reproductive health in different parts of the world, including Armenia. He directed the USAID-funded project, Advancing Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment in Armenia, implemented in collaboration with the Yerevan State University. Professor Agajanian, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. And it's a pleasure and an honor to share this session. I'll, of course, will be very brief. What I'll do, I will introduce each speaker, and when everyone will have about 15 minutes to talk, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So let's proceed then. Our first speaker is Irina Armenian. And Dr. Alektanyan is a political scientist, climate negotiator, and published author. Dr. Alektanyan holds a doctorate degree in political science from the University of Cambridge, and the main area of expertise is political leadership, states in transition, climate politics, environmental management, gender, and gender and conflict, as well as security studies. Dr. Nahabidagan served as a Deputy Minister of Environment for the Republic of Armenia in 2018 and 2020, and currently she's a Senior Advisor on Climate Change to the World Bank Group. And she also teaches at the American University of Armenia. She's a published author and published numerous publications, including a book titled Post-Soviet Armenia, a New National Elite and New National Narrative. The title is Demanding a Handshake, Gendered Experiences of Policy Production. Go ahead, Irina.
Thank you so much. It is truly an honor to be here today with all of you, and it's incredibly humbling to follow such an esteemed panel that just presented fascinating topics with massive food for thought, and certainly for myself, more energy for further action on gender equality in Armenia. I have flagged it to the organizers that unfortunately since 2015, I have not conducted any academic or deep research related to gender. So my reflections will be in my talk. My reflections will be from the academic and in-depth research we have done in 2015 with a team of researchers, but I would reflect more on my experiences in public office in Armenia, especially considering that we were really looking forward to seeing gender equality in this new administration following the 2018 Velvet Revolution in Armenia, and a very bold and ambitious agenda that we saw coming through with this new administration. If you don't mind, I would like to share my screen for some observations. So in thinking about how to structure my my talk today, I wanted to title it with the most, perhaps, and I would call it traumatic and awakening experience I had as a senior public official in the Armenian government. And that had to do with simple difficulty to have myself seen as a decision maker in the ocean of male colleagues. And it started with the fact that the acknowledgement of equal merit and equal capacity simply wasn't there. And I will talk about that. And hence my talk titling Demanding a Handshake. It was a constant struggle to position myself as an equal decision maker to my male colleagues, despite the fact that in many circumstances, my capacity and merit far out surpassed those of my male colleagues. I want to start by giving us all a cold shower. It was 3 years ago when Gohad, a good friend of mine, a panelist on this session, a neighbor, and turns out also we share ancestry together. Our ancestors hail from an incredible part of Artsakh. We were both on a panel in 2018, I think it was May or June, and Gohad will correct me, where there was really high expectation from the emerging government that they will really see through on promises of gender equality. And when I speak about gender equality, I want to make sure, and I will reiterate it constantly, that in my understanding, this also is reflecting the merit and true capacity of our society, because statistics, data, reality shows that Armenian women in education outperform our male colleagues. So I think if we want to build a strong government, we certainly and absolutely must give more room for women decision makers in public office. So in starting my talk, I want to make sure that we face the unfortunate reality of current administration's cabinet. In 2018, Pashinyan and his government came with bold and ambitious promises that there will be true gender parity, not only in legislature, but also in the executive. We saw very little of that in the first convocation of this administration of the legislature of the Armenian National Assembly. More so, we did not see that reflection, unfortunately, in the executive. The first cabinet had all but 2 female ministers. And then the most recent election in June of 2021 further reduced Armenian cabinet to only 1 female minister, and that is Nahabidagan, who is currently the Minister of Healthcare of the Republic of Armenia. I'm keeping this slide very intentionally because I want you to take note of the body language in this slide. Not only there is a massive predominance of male ministers and heads of state, but also Anahit is pushed back, if you notice, by her male colleagues in this photo. I think it is very, very telling of the state of play of the current administration, despite the fact that 3 years ago, there were very high hopes from civil society, from academics, that there will be true change in this new administration, considering the largely progressive agenda with which they came to power. So as I noted, unfortunately, cabinet is least represented. We have only 1 female minister currently in the government. Parliament has, thankfully to the quotas, finally, that have been adopted by the government. We have 36 female deputies out of 107, which is actually 34%. Again, it's actually short of what Armenia was before. Today's conference is titled, talking about post-Soviet Armenia, and in fact, the first Armenian parliament, which was still staffed with a lot of Communist Party members, was 35% of female deputies, and that was 3 times the size of current National Assembly that we have. We do not have any female governors in the administration of our MARSs. What is more troubling, unfortunately, is that we do not have any public acknowledgement of the problem at hand. It seems to have been pushed because, obviously, of the very pressing issues initially related to the COVID-19 pandemic and the unfortunate loss of life that we've had as a result of that, the Artsakh war that has led to massive loss of life and damage to health, damage to the psyche of the Armenian nation in Armenia and globally. With all due recognition of all of these challenges that Armenia faced, unfortunately, I do not see any justification why there has been such a massive pushback on the back burner of the issue of gender inclusiveness and gender responsiveness by the Armenian government that came on a very high agenda of women's role in public administration. And unfortunately, with that being said, there's no discussion on how to improve this. There are very flagrant and populistic statements coming out from politicians who are addressed this question, and we don't have any substantive dialogue as to why the promises that have been made 3 years ago are not met. Now, this is these are just 8 out of the 10 governors of Armenia. All of the 10 governors of Armenia are men. And what is even more troubling, that there's double the number of vice governors in the country, and all of them are men as well. And I will elaborate further as to why I'm doubling down on this unfortunate statistic, particularly relating to public office in rural parts of Armenia outside of the capital. Now, when Anna Melikian, Evgenia Ivanova, and myself in 2015 conducted an extensive study and surveyed professionals and many women from the civil society on the state of play and in an attempt to understand where the country stood and where our society stood when it came to women's participation in the political landscape of the country. What we came across are these following obstacles, and what I want to reiterate certainly is, unfortunately, 6 years from the time we have done this study and published with the support of USAID, we continue to see the same obstacles still in place and largely seemingly insurmountable. Our previous panelists talked extensively about gender prejudices and cultural factors of traditional family and women not necessarily being conceived of as decision makers or strong public figures. There is, unfortunately, and I find this obstacle to be one of the most damning ones, is the lack of social demand. And that ties with the fact that, unfortunately, our society, whether that is within the public sector or in rural Armenia, there seems to be no conceivable understanding of a female professional being able to make decisions that would be to the benefit of governance and well-being of our country. There is the very unfortunate factor of lack of interest of women themselves because of the social and cultural conditioning that we have so predominantly have in our society. Another very practical and very real factor is the lack of economic and political resources that women often do not have access to in order to initiate their own political engagement in the larger political dialogue, political landscape, or political discourse. There is an overwhelming sexism in our political culture, and I will reflect on that from my personal experiences in not being seen as an entity capable of making decisions. And unfortunately, the sexual content of the discourse on political women, we have seen this in previous administrations. Unfortunately, we do see this with the current administrations, and I'll bring example of Mr. Kochen reflecting on Arpine Hovhannisyan. And it was such a unexpected turn of events where you expect the opposition that would be so vocal and condemning any type of sexual content towards women in power, doing exactly the same when they turn into the position of power. So I think it is very important to also underline this particular unfortunate circumstance in our political discourse that discourages particularly young women to enter politics. Now, about the gendered experiences in policy production, here I want to focus specifically on my experience over the 2.5 years I served as a senior official in the government. What I have observed, and this is not just my anecdotal observation, I have also had access to data on how the public sector was staffed. It is predominantly and overwhelmingly staffed with women. Now, when we talk about policy making, ministries are those very institutions within the government that are charged with the functions of producing policies. And whether it is Ministry of Defense or Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, or the economy, most of the positions from very junior to mid-level senior are largely employed by women. So the reason I'm bringing this statistic is because I want to showcase that the entire value chain or the supply chain of the decision-making process within these policymaking institutions in Armenia is supplied by women. Women are the driving force. They are the energy behind the policy production. Yet, when it comes to the actual decision making, when the policy paper is ready, it is usually men that make those decisions. And I think the earlier image that I showed you with ministers in power is the best showcase of that unfortunate event where most of these ministries are staffed with very high qualified women with extensive experience or with good academic backgrounds to provide some very good content to policy production of respective ministries, but they are entirely left out when it comes to decision making. reflecting on sexism, of which I spoke earlier, I think in my case, when once you are in a senior position and you don't have much time to elaborate on extensive texts that feed into the content of policymaking and lawmaking, you read through executive summaries, and most of your time as a high-level senior official, you spend negotiating and meeting senior colleagues in the government or international partners. And one of the things that you confront, unfortunately, is in those meetings, in those communications, is the sexism that's so flagrantly displayed through body language. And this has been on numerous occasions, far more than I would ever wanted to experience, where I would walk into a room of male officials who would be of same ranking or below, and I would not be greeted by a handshake. Men would greet each other with a handshake. They would pass by me with a very light nod, and they would greet other men with handshake below my rank. That, obviously, for very objective reasons, infuriated me on many occasions. And I have started addressing this, and thankfully my supervisor when I worked in public office was very open to discussion on this very issue. And I've addressed this a number of times, and he was very transparent and very open on ways of countering that invisibility of me as a decision maker and as a senior official. And he advised that in order to make myself seen to those men, male colleagues, whether senior or junior of my position, I had to demand the handshake. That stuck with me, and I think it will certainly develop into an academic research further down the road. But from my practical and professional experience, that was certainly a revelation that unfortunately women in higher positions, where they are given by the virtue of their post an ability to make decisions, are not seen by their male colleagues as equal, and that you have to demand the space within which they will see yourself equally by demanding such body language as a handshake. So with that simple seemingly gesture, I had to start demanding the gendered spaces and equality. And as bizarre as it might sound, unfortunately, that is the reality in Armenia. You start creating the spaces not by simply sitting at the table or demanding a place at the table, but from the very start when you greet your male colleagues of seniority or juniority, that you are here and you have something to say. So again, reflecting on why demand, again, I think it is absolutely paramount to break the sexist political culture that we have in our country, whereby women are observed as entities that serve as the entire value chain of decision-making process, but in and of themselves do not constitute a decision-making entity. I think that is very crucial for us to start breaking, and we have to do that. So immediately at the outset of creating the body language, creating the space for ourselves to be acknowledged as such is by greeting men as equals. We also have to shift the non-acknowledgement of decision-making power. Again, it's not simply about making yourself heard, it's about making yourself present and creating those spaces where you are acknowledged as a decision maker in the political landscape of traditional conservative Armenian politics. And of course, disrupting this default notion that leadership positions or leadership as such is masculine. So, being aggressive, being loud, it is by default required for you to be there. Whereas I would strongly argue against that type and propagate the idea that instead of accepting that default leadership is masculine, we have to unpack what true leadership is and what women can bring to true leadership, which is, in my case, when I was in the position of senior public authority, I ensured that my style of governance was very horizontal. I was a network leader. I engaged particularly women in decision-making positions within the ministry, junior to my position in collective decision-making. So in and of themselves, I wanted to make sure that in the process of decision-making, women that are present in the process also have a say in the final making of the decision pertaining to one or the other policy. So I think it is very important for those who enter public office to start breaking this idea that leadership position, particularly in public office, whereby Armenian institutions and governments are structured so incredibly vertical that you start breaking this very stereotypical and crystallized idea of masculinity. Now I'm a little bit over my time.
Yes, Irina, yes, if I may ask you just to conclude, we have to allow room for all speakers.
Sure. I will conclude perhaps with one, I think recommendations are self-explanatory on the slide, but the way I would conclude is, and what I would stress certainly is that we need to ensure that the government is meaningfully engaging women in public sector and not simply brushing off the fact that women are not interested. We've tried, we've reached out, we've approached, which are very, very feeble arguments when it comes to engagement of women in the highest position in the public sector. I think what is very important to stress is merit and capacity, and the statistics shows that Armenian women certainly merit high senior level decision-making positions and have the capacity to execute those roles effectively. And moreover, I think what is very important is supporting a large-scale awareness campaign from massive outreach to capital and to rural communities that women are equal to men when it comes to decision making and high level political decisions. And lastly, I think what is absolutely important is working on the entire value chain of political power within Armenia and focus not only on the cabinet positions, but also on governors, vice governors, and village mayors. I ended that. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Irina. Thank you. Next presenter is Dr. Angoha Shaknazayan, who's the director of Yerevan State University Center for Gender and Leadership Studies, and also the co-founder and co-director of Women's Fund for Armenia. She's a sociologist and an associate professor at the Department of Applied Sociology at YSU. And she also coordinates the MA program on women leadership and development. There's a number of directed and coordinated number of large-scale projects. I had the personal pleasure of working with Gohar on the big project, USAID funded project that Megan mentioned earlier. And she also participated in a number of other important activities and has published extensively. Her presentation is The Situation of Women's Rights in the Context of Multiple Crises in Armenia. Gohar?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Victor. I don't know, do you see my screen? Because I shared the presentation. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, first of all, and also thank you, Irina, for this very interesting presentation and sharing your experiences, your personal experience of being a women leader and a policymaker. And unfortunately, Irina is not the only one that constantly experiences discrimination and sexism in the public life and in education and in other spheres. And I would present also some statistics that will show, that will sort of continue Irina's also thoughts and presentation. So first of all, I would like to start from the pre-COVID situation, because unfortunately COVID and war in Artsakh, they affected a lot the situation of the most vulnerable.
Sorry, Gohar, we only see part of your screen or part of your text. Can you adjust your slide or your presentation so that we see the entire?
Yes.
Thanks.
How does it look now? It's better? Yeah, okay. So yes, I would like to start from the pre-COVID sort of situation and pre-war in a way, because these two major crises affected the situation of the most vulnerable groups, the most marginalized groups, which are and women and young people among them. And especially we can see this, how it affected women. Unfortunately, like first of all, I want to mention that the economic situation in Armenia prior to COVID was described as quite, in a relatively good position. And there was some, already growth, economic growth, and the average wage in Armenia has also undergone some growth, and for women as well. Actually, we will see it a little bit later. But the COVID, the situation with COVID impacted mostly women and the most vulnerable women, which we will see later in the presentation, which are those, the groups. And again, in 2021, we, when we look at these rankings in the international gender indexes, we can see that Armenia actually went quite behind on a lot of positions, because right now it's on the 114th place according to the global gender gap indexes. And for example, in 2019, you see it was in 1908 and even 97, 98. And the main changes occurred in the sub-index of economic participation and opportunity for women. So it's basically from the 78th place to 96th in 2021. And this is the most logical explanation. It's of course severe consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also we have to take into account that the situation of women in the labor market was also quite, troubling. And because a lot of women, there is first of all a big gender gap in the wage gap that I will show. And besides, there is a lot of the huge proportion of women that are in informal economy and also performing this so-called unpaid care work. And also in this ranking of the Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Armenia is on the 25th place, unfortunately, out of 26 countries. And Irina already put some faces among these, behind these numbers on women in politics, which is also, you can see it's quite on a low ranking. It's, for example, 182nd place among 193 countries by the percentage of women in the ministerial positions, which Irina presented the faces, and we saw the situation quite well. I will not repeat what Irina already said. Now we have, yes, quite big relatively number of women in the National Assembly. And for the first time, the representation of women exceeded the quota, because as you know, we have quota now for the political parties. And the majority of women are in the political factions, Hayastan and civil contract. But in general, again, in community decision making, and especially in rural communities, the participation of women is very low. And the main reasons, unfortunately, it's also the perception of community leaders and fear to express themselves, lack of self-confidence among women, and also some, again, cultural and stereotypical perception of women's role. And there are no women governors, of course, and only 2 of the 12 deputy governors, as we can see. And it all reflects also on the level of the attitudes. There is the latest research survey conducted by the International Republican Institute. It shows that 80% of Armenians mentioned that women are not actively involved in the political life. which means there is this acknowledgement that women are not active. And the main reason that the society gives is that women are preoccupied with childcare and housekeeping, which is in a way, of course, true, but there are also a lot of other obstacles for women. It's overall, according to this survey, this only 7% of women compared to 14% of men are interested in running for political office. And interestingly, 15% equally are interested in joining any political party. Also, when it comes for the for certain positions, here we see that relatively more people see women in the position of deputy ministers and even ministers than in the position of community heads, which Irina was describing. So it's interesting that, you know, deputy minister, and Irina herself was a deputy minister. It's more probably because we have some women now as deputies, it's more acceptable. But community heads and also administrative, even head of village, people see less women on these positions. Among very worsening trends, it's a cyberbullying and online sexism toward women leaders, because it's not only on the level of overall perception, but it's also on every day on social media that a lot of women activists, women's rights defenders, political leaders are attacked by these anti-gender, anti-human rights campaigns. And there are really like very well organized smear campaigns against women human rights defenders and in general among women who are vocal, who are active in public life. It's also blaming women for, lately we've seen that for political instability and even war, and all, you know, like finding this scapegoat and blaming women's organizations and everything that is not going well. It's basically these active women who are blamed for. And also a lack of protection for women's rights defenders and impunity that we've seen. And that's why this cyberbullying became also so widespread, because these abusers were never properly punished. So when it comes to gender inequality in the labor market, in this context of deepening crisis, it's really quite, again, like a problematic situation that we see, because right now, this is the latest statistics from the National Statistical Committee, 50% of women don't have a job and don't even look for a job. And when we compare to the first 4 months of 2020, and in the first 4 months of 21, the number of men looking for a job has been increased, whereas the number of women stayed the same. Of course, there are different reasons for that, but again, when we see this statistic, it shows quite well that the number, the regional outlook also shows that, and I don't know why, I have to look into that more, except for the Lori region, there are more people looking for a job everywhere in Armenia, and relatively more people looking for a job, for example, in Ararat and Kotak regions, and women respectively as well. So this is more about regions, because it's also, we have regions with high female percentage of female poverty, and those regions are actually like Ararat and Kotak regions among them. It's interesting that it always was like that, and now we see it even probably more vividly, that marital status plays a role in employment opportunities. Among all the groups of women, divorced women comprise a majority of employed women, actually. And then the largest discrepancies are found in the couples with children, which I found very interesting. The number of children affect the labor market-related activities for women, but not for men. For example, a mother of 2 children experiences a 6 times higher non-participation rate in the labor market than a father of 2. And and also when we look at on the level of perception, social attitude, we see that men compare like 66% of women compared to 75% of men believe that it is better for preschool children if their mother doesn't work. So we still have this attitude that mother is the only one basically taking care of children. Gender pay gap stays quite high for I think compared to this in other countries in our region, it's quite high, it's 34.7%. And according to the latest data from the World Bank, women in Armenia earn 20% less than men. And several factors actually exacerbate this deepening of gender wage gap. And among them, it's age, because we see that women in the age group of 50-54 are the most vulnerable. And it's the gender wage gap is higher in this category. Women from the regions of Armenia earn less compared to men and compared to women living in the capital of Armenia, Yerevan. And also education, women with lower secondary education earn less compared to men. This is also something that we should look into, the education, age, because usually we talk about women as very as homogeneous group, but here we can see that it's not, it affects different groups of women in a different way. When we have growing number of women-owned businesses, even though they are younger than men-owned businesses, 6 years of operation versus 8.5 years of operation for men. They are smaller than men-owned businesses and mostly represented by widowed or divorced women. And these are the businesses that were affected by the COVID-19 pandemic the most. And there are noticeable gender differences in the initial source of financing for the businesses as well. It's interesting that usually men use more of their personal or household saving to start a business, whereas women rely on loans from bank, which makes them even more vulnerable in a way, because it's not their personal savings and they have to pay eventually back to these loans. And moreover, women are 3 times more likely than men to borrow money from friends and relatives, which is also an interesting statistics coming from the latest reports of international financial corporations. And women-led enterprises, basically, as I mentioned, were negatively affected by the crisis, and they're heavily concentrated in the hardest hit by the lockdown services, which is hospitality, beauty services. And also COVID-19 unfortunately hit social enterprises run by civil society organizations, basically the social enterprises that are developing by small groups, running by very few women, and mostly maybe even home-based income generated businesses. And also women-owned businesses are also uncertain and less, for example, less optimistic about the recovery from this pandemic than men. It's also very disturbing that more male-owned firms actually got support from the government, and they assess this support as positive compared to female-owned businesses. Women female-owned businesses felt that they received very insignificant benefits from the government, being affected the most by this the crisis. Of course, this is all coming from also the educations, and we see here that more women than men enrolled to receive master degrees. But what happens, and we always discuss this, and I remember we had very interesting conversations with Professor Alektanyan about this years ago. What's happening with these women that are getting master degrees, and now even you see that we have a lot of much more female students than male students, and even in the male dominated sort of branches of education. Of course, on the level of doctors of sciences, it's still we have more men, but still compared to like in the past few years, the number of women getting master degrees and enrolled in education in general is quite high. But then, as we've seen on the labor market, it's not represented proportionally. And also,
sorry, Gohar,
yes.
I just want to remind you about the time constraint. So if you
yes, I will not go into. Okay, I will skip a couple of slides, and we'll probably talk about.
We want to give everyone a chance to present
sure.
and have a good productive discussion. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, because now we talk a lot about STEM education, and we always mention that Armenia is quite high in terms of women's involvement in the IT. It's not low, it's 30%, but at the same time, we see that even with these favorable factors in place, which is younger staff and the opportunity to work remote, etc., there is only 11% of women among leaders in IT sphere, which is also another problem. And yes, crisis is an exacerbating factor for gender-based violence, but I know that you're having tomorrow a discussion about it, so I will skip that. I will just maybe end with this trend in the continuous crises that we observe now. It's that women are becoming the only breadwinners of their families because of in particular, because of the war. And unpaid care work performed by women is increasing even further. And now it's quite, I didn't show that slide. I'm sorry, I think I skipped that one, but it's a lot of like unpaid care work performed by women everywhere in the world. And psychological and emotional well-being of women is suffering. Increase of domestic violence as a result of war, which it's always happening. And as a result of war, there is an increase in sexual violence and domestic violence. And also women's rights, gender equality are becoming less prioritized in general. Increased militarism, nationalism, and rigid gender roles in the society. And also we fear that this anti-gender movement targeting women's rights defenders will become even more widespread and more active, unfortunately. So not a lot of positive trends, but hopefully we can have a productive discussion about what we can do with these trends. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gohar. And so our next panelist is Karina Karapetyan-Dupuy. Karina is the chair of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Antelope Valley College, and also serves as a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. And Karina's research currently focuses on activities focused on community partnerships in the Greater Antelope Valley, which aim to support students of color, low income, first generation, and homeless student population. Karina is currently working on 2 LGBTQ biographies, and Karina's title is The Challenges of Transnational Armenian Female Migrant Laborers. Karina?
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. First off, I'm exceedingly grateful to Melissa, Bilal, and all the other organizers to bring us together with this event, because back in 2012, when I completed this work on transnational female migrant laborers, I never had the opportunity to present any of my findings in Armenian studies context. So there weren't many spaces to explore this phenomenon in a post-Soviet Armenian female transnational migrant context. So thank you again for organizing this conference. My project was about Armenian women's traditional roles being renegotiated through labor migrations to the United States between the 1990s through to 2010. The aim of this research delved into women's lived experiences, thoughts, and feelings as migrant laborers who were forced to leave their homes and work abroad in order to financially sustain their families back in Armenia. Through individual interviews, focus groups, and primary literary sources, I sought to illuminate the challenges and voices of Armenian female migrant laborers in the US and those who returned back to Armenia, because there were a handful that did return. The study was undertaken primarily because the lives of Armenian women were rarely addressed at the time and discussed in scholarship on migration, diaspora, labor, and gender. Just to give you some background context, and this is the stuff I couldn't share in an ASA conference, for example, in the early 1990s, I had the opportunity to get to know some of the first wave of Armenian migrants who came to Los Angeles in droves after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At the time, I was a young teenager in and out of homelessness and poverty. And many of these newly immigrated Armenians had settled in the south part of Glendale. And I quickly discovered all the ways in which they struggled to survive and make ends meet in the US. And often I would help family members out by translating documents, writing formal letters, filling out job applications, and drafting resumes for them. In exchange, I would hang out with them and they would make me a bunch of khorovats. And now, of course, I resemble, as Tamar Shirinian, my friend, would say, I resemble Armenchik, the singer. Incidentally, this was around one of my first times and direct contacts with this thing called sweatshop work. As many of the Armenian women that I knew and had become acquainted with, were being actively recruited into exploitative and abusive forms of shadow labor in the garment industries, bakeries, markets, and as domestic workers throughout Los Angeles. This period of time left such a great impression on me that I eventually made my way back to this community as a graduate student and as a researcher. So the main focus questions here that I highlighted in my work were: what factors led the women to decide to migrate? What types of gendered work did they acquire and perform in the US, specifically within Armenian American communities? Why did some of women, I interviewed, actually return back to Armenia after working here in the United States? And how did the experience of migration affect women's attitudes and aspirations for themselves? So although Armenian women tended to be educated, they found it difficult to obtain work in Armenia. In Miriam Ohanyan's Discrimination of Women in Employment, she found that in 1999, women constitute 51% of people with a high level of education, yet 65% of the unemployed were female. There was a notable a quotation from a senior democratization assistant from the OSCE office, who once stated 66% of the unemployed in Armenia are women. However, more than half of the people with university education are women. And one can say that the university diploma for a majority of Armenian women is the first and last achievement. While men had become a numerical minority in Armenia, they still dominated the job sector, which left women unemployed. In fact, Armenian women's unemployment rates were 3 times higher than men's during the early 1990s. And I'm kind of backtracking a little bit from where Gohar left off, so I'm kind of going back in time. Up until the early 2000s, Armenian women could be refused employment because of their marital status. Regardless of their higher education qualifications, women were discriminated against at work. Traditional gender roles continued to permeate the types of jobs that women and men performed, and this extended to educated women as well as those who were not as educated. Women, for example, typically found positions in various caretaking roles such as nursing or teaching in the K through 12 sector, while men pursued upper management roles in professional employment as lawyers and economists. The National Statistical Service of the Republic of Armenia in 2009 reported that during the early 2000s, despite their relatively high educational assets, for every $150 US Armenian women earned, men earned $250. The evidence from a variety of sources indicated that the main reason why women immigrated to find work abroad was because of money. Money was the primary reason for leaving their home country. The CEDAW released a comprehensive legal outline of Armenian women's rights in September 1999, stating a list of laws which were meant to protect Armenian women in employment, education, and domestic sectors. However, it became quickly evident that the conception itself was flawed, for the Armenian government had not clearly defined the boundaries of discriminatory actions and behaviors against women. Consequently, a few decades later, discrimination remained an ongoing reality. Moreover, while achieving written laws constitute an achievement, there still remain many challenges for Armenian women to overcome in practice. Legislation alone did not guarantee social and economic and cultural change accordingly. Many Armenian women continue to face high unemployment rates, low wages, and sometimes even domestic violence. Not only was this double standard widely upheld in Armenia, a discriminatory mentality transfers over and plays out within the larger diaspora. The picture I would gain from my own interviews with Armenian women migrants was more nuanced and more troubling. The women who related their life stories to me described how they had just adjusted to difficult circumstances in Armenia, and then they were trying to achieve this adjustment in the United States as well. It was evident that they had found it extremely hard to reconcile assumed gender roles and notions of independence, not interdependence. Thank you very much. This was true not only among poor women, but also among those who were upper middle class and or well-educated respondents. As a result, I would learn that many hopes had been deferred. In the course of my research amongst Armenian American women or Armenian women, I would discover an older generation investing hopes in their descendants and a younger generation uneasy about the image of Armenia transmitted by their parents based on what they had witnessed. A combination of educational attainment and frustration about lack of occupational and economic opportunities led middle class as well as poor women to leave Armenia. More than half of the women leaving in 2003 claimed that they were leaving for employment, career opportunities, and of course, low wages were some of the top reasons why they went abroad. The decision process is difficult as there are more of a collective effort of women traveling abroad. It sort of was like a group effort to get women to travel abroad because women's traveling basically was dictated and controlled by the conditions of what was established by their homeland families. So they would kind of make these contacts based on what their family was telling them they could do, whereas men were a little bit more independent when they were traveling. During the post-Soviet early 1990s, commonly referred to as Mut or dark days, First Lady of Armenia, Lucia Petrosyan, once pointed out women's special role within these networks after the breakup of the old Soviet regime in 1991. She emphasized the crucial roles of Armenian women at home and within the community, which ultimately preserved the survival of Armenia as a country. She observes that the loss of Armenia had engendered a fear in women that they would once lose their homeland again. It is rhetoric like this that further evokes fear and stigmatization for the Armenian women who do wish to travel abroad. As previously mentioned, some of the interviewees felt guilt and shame in expressing to me that they wanted to leave Armenia, sometimes even permanently, to seek out a better life for themselves and their families. Rigid cultural norms also meant that most Armenian women were less likely to leave their families permanently because of all the cultural pressures and constraint that were expected of them. And so just to give you an example, I had interviewed one woman, and of course, some of these women were doctors, MDs, MFAs with Masters of Fine Art and piano. This one person specifically, the MFA, she was a domestic worker and she had become like kind of a manager, and she organized this kind of undocumented labor movement where she afforded the employees that she supervised free health insurance and also rights and protections. She didn't want to give that up. One woman I interviewed worked for an Armenian American family who was abused. Her passport was taken away. She wasn't allowed to call me. I had to actually pick her up because she had to pretend that she was going grocery shopping for the family. So that's when I swooped in and I picked her up. And despite the fact that the family was explicitly abusive and basically telling her that you're only good for teaching our children Armenian, telling the kids, whispering, don't learn anything else from this woman from Hayastan, but, learn the language. She still wanted to stay in America because, she didn't want to return back to a patriarchal dominant culture and society. So it was clear to me, despite their educational qualifications, Armenian women tended to conform to this pattern. And the trends showed that Armenian women typically found short-term seasonal positions as caretakers, cleaners, and domestic workers that I just outlined. While some of my interviewees performed casual work, Others did not prosper, mainly through small family businesses. So the NSSRA has tried to track immigration patterns. Of course, this is difficult to do, as everybody knows. But the figures showed that between the years of 1992 and 1995, they experienced the highest amount of traffic for both men and women exiting and entering Armenia, at approximately 30 to 40,000 migrants each way. By the late 2000s, those numbers began to taper off at rates of 50 to 60% for men and women respectively. Moreover, in 2009, 75% of female immigrants from wealthier urban cities, which was the capital, like for example, the capital of Yerevan, reported that 55.6% of the women traveling were from these areas between the ages of 20 to 49. And the other 53% consisted of women over the age of 50. So of course, these data sets were sometimes unreliable for a variety of reasons. To conclude, women's symbolic significance as the maintainers of the thread of life continues to exert a powerful influence within Armenia today and in the diaspora. I found in doing my research that even those women who question aspects of their gender destinies were profoundly affected by these inherited cultural assumptions about their gender identities. Although this approach has been adopted by women active in nationalist movements, I was all too aware that for my interviewees, the merging of the individual in the nation made it extremely difficult for Armenian women to question gender relations. Upholding their duty to the nation has gendered cultural meanings in terms of sexuality, reproduction, domesticity. This is an extremely complex negotiation for Armenian women who bear the main brunt of family expectations. I found an explanation for the strength of the obstacles, which I kept hearing during my interviews, in the theoretical work of Levon Abramyan. He argues in Armenian Identity in a Changing World for a Different Interpretation of the Nation. He maintains that the terms nation and nationalism, which he sees as carrying a Eurocentric political characteristics, is quite different from the Armenian word ozg, which carries multiple meanings of tribe, clan, people, order, and class simultaneously. He maintains that despite the use of the word ozg to signify nation, it continues to be used as a way to signify tribe and family. Abramyan argues that the family and nationality are bound together in this context and are not separate functioning concepts, which his work made me more aware of, that the same word can have so many different types of meanings. Armenian women migrants carried the contradictory expectations within them that they sought out a better life in another country. The clash of these values is especially stark because of the stress on individualism, which those who leave for America had encountered, or who left for America encountered. Moreover, the women I interviewed describe how migrating to America from Armenia had been a daunting project, and they were balancing multiple identities as survivors, descendants, mothers, caretakers, workers, and preservers of a culture and a homeland, all while trying to find a decent paying, non-exploitative work, jobs, a career path here in the United States. Thank you. I was trying to consolidate 400 pages in 15 minutes. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Karina. So our last, not least, presenter is Nelly Sargsyan. Nelly is a feminist scholar who situates herself at the disciplinary intersections of political anthropology, queer studies, and critical race studies, among others. Her scholarly interests range from the interrelatedness of queer diasporic belonging, nationalism, and trauma, to political work that cultivates feminist consciousness and collective care to direct street action, public performance, and feminist storytelling. Presentation title is Beyond All Necropolitics. Go ahead, Neil.
Thank you very much. I'm having trouble sharing my screen, but I don't want to spend time on that. So just work with me with your beautiful imaginations. So in conditions of what I see as palimpsestic colonization, the latest of which through the shape-shifting Russian Empire and multinational corporations and collective traumas, both insidious everyday and catastrophic events, how can we recognize and accept others' vulnerability across borders of nation states to become human again, or perhaps for the first time? I'm interested in contending with our ongoing collective traumas in our very bodies and cultivating imagination that is oriented towards sustaining and building life with others, because it is through acts of mutual aid and other forms of collective care that we keep the ongoingness of life. Thinking of trauma as insidious, in Laura Brown's terms, allows us to see the connection between everyday expressions of systemic oppression, its accumulation, like daily heterosexism, sexism, and various forms of abuse that have been normed as ethno-cultural lifeways, and traumas as catastrophic events, pointing to the need for structural change. One grows up in Armenia hearing and accumulating in their body and psyche these words, and the affective worlds that they evoke. So in these atmospheric conditions of kachenk, varenk, spanenk, satkatsnenk that recall conditions of colonization that Achille Mbembe defines as, quote, as a form of leprosy that attacks bodies and deforms them, producing beings of pain, whose existence is being constantly exposed to the other's will, unquote. Uprooting gendered, racialized, and sexualized injustices is not possible through just representation, as they are embedded in the conditions themselves. So we need to transform these conditions as well as our relationships, orienting toward collective thriving. This is where I see the uprooting of sexism, racism, and heteronormativity possible. The core of my paper is about cultivating imagination towards sustaining life, about imagining a world where trauma has been turned on its head and into thriving. Thinking of the present, however, I work with Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, subjugation of life to the power of death that creates a permanent condition of living in pain. In 2016-2017, during another period of political hopelessness following the 4-day armed escalation between Armenia and Azerbaijan in April 2016 and July 2016 Sasnatsarar takeover of a police station in Yerevan, feminist environmentalist Angoha Shaknazayan and I conducted interviews with 26 politically active people in Armenia, including our dear Irina Alektanyan, to learn about what called them to political action, to find out quite gendered political worlds. On the way to one of my interviews, a cab driver shared with me an anecdote from his childhood in the 90s, when he witnessed how Sashik, and this is his word, Sashik is the brother of former President Sir Sarkisian. So Sashik and his men, in the driver's words, defiled someone for attempting to pay 800 drams, a bit less than $2, for gas at Sashik's gas station. My dad said, look what they're doing to that guy. They defiled him. They beat him up publicly, spit on him, defiled him. For pleasure. If a cat scratches you, wouldn't you yell and say, Tarem kes? Oh, well, I guess hitting is a way of taking out your frustration and anger. And I hope I don't become a Sashik, although maybe when I do, I won't notice that I did. He was sharing this story as an illustration for an earlier claim that he had made that if Sashik or another oligarch saw someone smashing their windshield, they would cut the person in pieces. The necropolitical elements of this anecdote were striking to me. The violence of the state shared with private actors like businessmen deployed in small doses of death that order the everyday, which also included the participation of the parent in this case. The body, as many theorists propose, becomes the ground for cultivating and negotiating social and political relations, embedding it in, quote, power, in it that power can be acquired and exercised only at the price of another's life, unquote. This kind of socialization of the body and mind gets further ethnocultural education in literature classes. Reading Rafi's novel Samvel, set in the 4th century, where Samvel famously kills both his parents due to his father's loyalty to the Persian king and his mother's conversion to Zoroastrianism. The students are particularly encouraged to learn Samvel's words before killing his mother, Aha ein sura vor spanets davajan hora, kaspani nayev uratsats mora, as an expression of an idealized patriotism and complete loyalty to the crumbling Christian Armenian sovereignty. No other interpretation would be invited or offered. But the ethnocultural education will continue in a history class where one would learn to recite Arshak II's capture by the said king, Shapur II. Arshak kills himself after the Persian king imprisons him because when stepping on soil brought from Armenia, the king notices that Arshak becomes defiant. Teachers will offer this as an object lesson of a resolute bond with your land, which reawakens your essence and your unbending courage, always gendered male, in the face of unequal power relations by choosing death over lost sovereignty. Sovereignty, one will also learn, is about protecting our soil and our borders against internal and external enemies expected to accept its necropolitics that exposes certain groups of people to death more than others, like young conscripts and officers on military contracts coming from precarious socioeconomic backgrounds, women and feminized others expected to be resilient, to keep life going under any circumstances, while preparing or prepared for a potential war and sacrifice. Queer and trans folks, people abandoned into socioeconomic precarity, whether living in freight cars or other precarious spaces for decades after an earthquake, or as a result of being displaced after a war, displacing people from their homes so a company can build commercial and residential building for profit, or convincing people to sell their land to a mining company. In other words, reducing people to precarious living conditions. Without much challenge, the Armenian ruling classes conceptualized sovereignty and politics in these necropolitical terms, using and sharing different weapons with other agents like states and corporations to destroy people and create death worlds, quote, new and unique forms of social existence in which groups of people are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. Unquote. At the same time as they are indifferent to the death of their enemies, however, they are fantasized across borders or within the borders. Through their pronouncements of appreciation and conferral of posthumous medals of heroism for some, Armenian state obscures its devaluation of the lives of those who were sent to be killed in wars fought in name of sovereignty. But this necropolitics is not bound to the borders of a nation state. In fact, it is quite a trans-regional project, as Armenia and Azerbaijan make certain groups of their denizens more exposed to death, sharing weapons to destroy them, bolstered by organized destruction and sacrificial economy, cheapening the price of life and habituating loss, as Membe puts it. We can also note the intensifying necropolitical elements of the Azerbaijani state's incursions, reorganization of its own economic regions to legitimate its claims for more territory, alongside lifting Soviet-era maps of enclaves to cartographically establish grounds for ongoing terror that is already underway by the regained control in parts of Karabakh, with the further militarization of daily life through Russian peacekeepers. While unequally distributed, this interstate terror encompasses the societies in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh. And I see Armenian and Azerbaijani governments not as opposed to each other, the ruling elites, but rather working together in the same logic of dispossession and necropolitics across the region, securing their respective places in power. In 2016, many of our interlocutors considered most political methods exhausted in Armenia. However, despite no hope for any tangible change in the foreseeable future, they valued horizontal decision-making, self-reflection, non-hegemonic knowledge creation, and collective care in political work. All our interlocutors agreed on the pervasiveness of devaluation of women in the Armenian society. Some women mentioned that in their political struggle, they have been used by their men comrades who try to fulfill their own political ambitions. Often, too, men take on representational roles and through them stay in deeper solidarity with those holding power. As Arev, one of the interlocutors, pointed out, so long as gender equity is viewed as secondary to fighting corruption and environmental degradation, a meaningful change is stunted. A close attention to the praxis of Armenian feminists on the left offers different politics, a way of life that attends to the preciousness of equitable relationality and cultivated across all scales, from intimate relations and conviviality to polity-level relations, for which no scale is too insignificant, no hierarchy of value life justified. Here I focus on two feminist projects. The first is Femme Collective's experience sharing project, aiming to cultivate political consciousness through co-creating fairy tales with children. And here's an excerpt from one that's called Kaleidoscope. There once was and there once wasn't a fox. It's just that when I was drawing, the ears turned out a little differently, so they look like a squirrel. Some foxes are foxes, some squirrels are squirrels, and some are both foxes and squirrels. They are tall like foxes, but have long ears like squirrels and live in a tree, surrounded by a fence. Squirrel fox was blind, Kuit, was a sister, Kuit, and was queer. There were some silly animals who would hurt squirrel fox, saying that squirrel fox was neither a fox nor a squirrel, was blind and could both jump and climb, run around and eat nuts. One day, squirrel fox and their friend Fly decided to make a rainbow, not any rainbow, but a magical one with 7 colors and 7 scents, the likes of which no one had ever seen before. Kids whose parents would not let them play under the rainbow with squirrel fox and Fly were honestly surprised that their parents were so fearful, because squirrel fox was wonderful. had extremely nimble fingers, could make anything. Squirrel Fox had beautiful ears and was very friendly. And Fly had such a sense of humor that all the little animals fell in love with the stories that Fly would buzz. The parents felt really embarrassed because even though they had been unkind to Squirrel Fox let the little animals to play under the rainbow. Some time later, Squirrel Fox and Fly decided to get rid of the fence because the love of the little animals was so big that there was no need to be afraid of anything or run from anything, and there was no way to hide from their curiosity either. This political consciousness takes imagination seriously as power to enact a world of caring relationality, allowing us to glean a hope of a livable life that refuses to accept that nothing will ever change. While this story shows what becomes possible if the imposed norms anchored in fear of difference are collectively abandoned, other stories in the collection tackle war, criminalization of poverty, and other issues. All stories highlight the joy that comes from collective care. Often people involved in creative and experience-sharing work are dismissed for being idealistic and unrealistic. Being asked to be realistic both by those against whom they struggle and those alongside whom they struggle is not about recognizing unalienable facts about human nature, as David Graeber reminds us. Rather, it is about recognizing, quote, the effects of the systemic threat of violence, unquote. One of the key goals of this project has been to make feminist interventions into stories co-created with children living in war-torn border villages of Armenia, with the voices of children from these often neglected villages to be heard alongside the voices of adults, and that the protagonists be girls and genderqueer characters. While the Femme Collective worked to minimize their intervention in the children's stories, they aim to expand children's worldview shaped by militarist nationalism, by dwelling on the children's lived experiences and realities and suggesting alternative resolutions. As Nane pointed out, the concerns and stories came from the children, whereas the politicization of the issues came from Femme Collective. For Arev, Nana, and Lilith, experience sharing, whether with adults or children, is important for increasing the number of people who are ready for political struggle while maintaining self-reflexivity to engage in a kind of decision-making that rejects patriarchal relationships and organizes life around collaborating with the ecosystems we inhabit instead of exploiting them. In their prefigurative political work, Armenian feminists insist on self-reflective refusal to serve what is immediately feasible and doable. They insist on cultivating the power one has inside together with rather than at the expense of others. In their prefiguration, they cultivate political imagination as a habit because, as Michael Tosic reminds us, only at the depth of habit is radical change effected. Another life-sustaining project on which I want to briefly focus is visual artist R.P. Adamyan's Magical World, where incorporating clay objects and multi-channel video projections, Adamyan takes up the issue of land and loss and her affective experience living in a landlocked and mountainous nation, cut off from other parts of the earth due to closed borders, inversing the landscape of the reality from a queer feminist perspective. A landlocked mountainous place becomes a network of islands in an ocean. The City of Dove Women, a sculpture's cityscape, one of the two projects that comprise Magical World, and on which I dwell here, tells of the environment where dove women, situated as queer characters, live and where the eternal water of life can be found. This is a biotechnological world consisting of multiple islands in an ocean body imagined as life-sustaining embryonic fluid. Adamyan's methodology of hybridization and kin-making ranges from nature, culture, sex toys, modernist Soviet Armenian architecture, historical narratives, science, magic, to analog digital realities. In retelling the story of Alektanyan, and for those who don't know, Alektanyan is Ghazaros Aghayan's fairy tale from the 19th century about a genderqueer character who's trying to figure out who they are, and it turns out they're actually tasked to also fight all evil in the world, which they end up doing, but not before claiming masculinity. Adamyan also retells the legend of Arshak II, offering a different lesson, orienting away from the single hero, seeing life as sustained by many working together toward collective thriving. Instead of taking an undifferentiated Armenian we for granted, Adamyan redefines it into a we oriented towards sustaining life. The architecture of the city constitutes a hybridization of Soviet Army and modernist architecture and sex toys. Viewers experience this in a double scale, as giants invited to touch the architectural pieces, the small scale of which renders them as pleasurable sex toys, and as denizens in the cityscape by mentally putting themselves in the cityscape at a smaller scale. We are invited into the city when it seems potentially abandoned, yet we learn from the voiceover that all dove women are underwater, participating in a certain stage of life making. Here, posthumans are communally produced by dove women and placenta jellyfish, a hybrid of placenta, clitoral muscles, and a jellyfish, a human and sea creature, digital and analog, with skin in fractals created infinitely, who also generates eternal water. Adamian works with natural materials like clay and porcelain, referencing both the durability and solidness of stone buildings, as well as softness and pliability of the material. Pleasure is both in the materiality of the world making, as she finds working with clay pleasurable and therapeutic, and in the material relations to which the world making gestures. Fingering with the past when making clay architectural objects, sex toys, referencing Soviet modernist buildings, Adamian uses, quote, the body as a channel for and means of understanding, unquote, and reworking a recent past, making the emergence of this world of eternal life possible at the site of trauma of many losses at different scales. By turning, should I finish?
Yeah, if you don't mind, just conclude so that we have time for discussion.
If the overlapping aims of the neoliberal and nation states projects are indeed to crush our imagination of other ways of becoming with each other by planting hopelessness, exposing people to precarity and death, then directing creative energies at imagination and collective care across borders, embracing and transforming trauma as we embed ourselves in our bodies in specific places to live in peace rather than rest in it, it becomes crucial. Because survival always involves others, as Anna Tsing reminds us, and is subject to indeterminacy of self and other transformations. I also just want to finish by saying that during our break, I found out about the death of Georgi Vanyan, a longtime anti-war activist, fighting for peace. So I just want to say, may we continue his work. Thank you.
Right. Thank you all very much. Very exciting, intriguing presentations. We have some time for discussion. I don't know where I don't insist on any rigid structure. So if you want to, if you received any specific questions, please air them and answer them. Then if you want just add something or comment on your co-panelist presentations, go ahead and do that as well.
I'll also add, sorry, I see a hand up, but if you can write your comments just in the Q&A, right, that would be great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so how do we want to proceed? Does anyone wants to start?
Do any of the panelists have any questions or comments on each other's presentations?
Or if you have something you felt that you had to skip because of my disciplining pressure, please go ahead and share them. I had one question for Gohar that I posted on chat, and not a question and answer, is whether we could see and think of a crisis or crisis in general as an opportunity for advancement of women's agency, representation, and impact. And I don't have any specific obviously answer or any specific kind of recipe for that, but I am just thinking how that can be, whether we can think in that from that perspective about crisis that Armenia has gone through lately.
Thank you, Victor. Yes, I think, of course, we can think of as an opportunity, and this is a good question. But at the same time, I don't see, unfortunately, these favorable conditions right now that will bring to this, will create these opportunities, because still as we see, we don't have a lot of women decision makers. We don't have women in the labor market. It's still this situation, it's just going in the opposite way. So I think if we really, like the state, the government should take serious steps and acknowledge that this is an opportunity also for perhaps some steps, some opportunities to bring this gender equality really not in reality, not just to talk, from the to leave it on a paper, but I don't see it, unfortunately, right now.
Well,
I don't
perhaps
see
yeah, thank you. I was thinking about whether there was, when I was asking this question, whether we can construe that the crisis as a sign of failure of male-dominated governing model. Whether there's any sign of that, and
yes.
And kind of expand on that in the direction of sort of greater involvement of women and greater gender equality, both in decision making and
yeah, it is a sign
different
of
spheres
failure
of life. Yeah.
Of patriarchy in a way, and all this that we're facing now, it shows that it's a failure. But at the same time, there is this tendency to keep power, obviously, and it will continue until there is really like women's consolidation, women's movement will take over. And also in this economic recovery program, for example, for Armenia, that the government presented, it's very little gender analysis. It's lacking gender sensitivity. So I think, yes, we can interfere in that perhaps, just to bring our expertise and to make all these recovery plans gender sensitive as much as possible right now. But I think it's a very good question, and it's a place for discussion, really, further discussion on how we can do that we join our efforts.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any other comments on any other aspects of what has been said or has not been said yet today?
I just wanted to comment on Flora's comment regarding crisis. I would say it depends on the conditions of the crisis. If the crisis is traumatic, then it tends to stop and action, not open possibilities. So I would concur with Flora in that respect. I mean, that's the other obstacle, right? There are folks that are already so traumatized, trying to work through trauma, and then it's only compounded by more abuse.
Victor, if I may, I wanted to add a couple of points. I think hypothetically speaking, in generalistic terms, crisis always creates opportunities. But I think in terms of gender equality in Armenia, we have to rephrase and conceive and push the narrative that gender inequality in and of itself is a crisis for our society from a socio-cultural perspective, from the continued trauma that our consecutive generations incur because of that inequality, from the perspective of non-engagement women and the asset of female population of Armenia in our economy. So I think from that perspective, it is rather we should rephrase that gender non-engagement is unfortunately a crisis in and of itself and push that type of narrative. Because unfortunately what I've seen after the two major crises of 2020, namely the coronavirus and the Artsakh war of 2020, important agendas such as gender equality or environmental agenda for that matter have been pushed back on the back burner as other priority items have come to fore. So I think we should restructure the understanding of crisis in the gender space. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a question for Nelly. Can you see that? Do you want to address that?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, for the question. Actually, maybe I can read just a small thing that I had, but I didn't have time. One of our interlocutors in our research was saying, you know, at its core, there is a class struggle. There are marginalized people who fought in the Karabakh war. They don't have anything. So they remained in the nationalist discourse. We're thinking about how to talk to people using the language of social justice and equality. And I'm thinking how this state contributed for so many years to eliminating any alternatives to pseudo-patriotism. If you talk to people, they want social justice, a comfortable, peaceful life, but they don't have that language. Instead, they call the police officers Turks. So, you know, and feminists in Armenia have worked on, you know, in different ways, in different directions, in terms of raising issues of anti-militarism and the damaging, also gendered effects of militarism in general and war. And oftentimes they would be met by, you know, these labels of one of the internal enemies. You know, just you're like, Turkey ջրաղացին ջուր լցնող եք, ազգին դեմ եք, you're just contributing to the rhetoric of our enemy, you know, the Turk, just dismissing it. So, you know, just trying these different strategies, work on the streets, creating texts, and you know, yeah, and then also this project of, okay, then, you know, we know maybe another way to do it is to work with children and you know, expand political consciousness through this. I don't know, I mean, it's an insufficient response, but I'm also aware of the time, Lisa.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, comments?
I believe there's a question in the Q&A from Tamar.
Yeah, let me see. Yeah, the couple, I guess. First, from a question from I see from Tamar Binyan, and that's is there any, which I kind of can also relate to, was going to ask a similar question for this. I think it's for Irina in her representation. Is there a possibility of transforming political culture itself so that it does not revolve around handshakes, just as a kind of masculine form of greeting? I know this will require more non-men, but within official political world. But I'm wondering if inclusion is enough. If masculine dominance, official politics has been a crisis. And I think it's more broadly, I mean, is this right strategy to get women's access into this men's club, or just to create a new club altogether, where all these old habits like handshakes and all this kind of, I mean, this is just an example. I mean, I don't necessarily think we should cancel that outright, but I'm just thinking more strategically, and that's kind of how I'm building on Tamar's question as well. Irina, you want to address this?
Sure, thank you, Victor. Tamar, a great question. One I was hoping someone would address because, in fact, that had slightly transformed in 2020 because of COVID-19 and the restrictions that were imposed on human-to-human proximity, and we had to reduce any contact. And in fact, that was even worse to women, because if before there were certain norms of acknowledging each other, now in COVID times, all these norms kind of dissipated, and you weren't sure whether you make yourself acknowledged through a fist bump or a nod or just simple gesture of acknowledging someone. So with that experience in mind, I think what is important is just understanding that a handshake is a symbolic way of acknowledging someone sitting next to you or in front of you, or greeting someone who has walked in to a space. So whether it's a handshake, a nod, whichever greeting it is, it's something that is a ritual by which one accepts the other. And I certainly understand that the part of Tamar's question, but that you're wondering if inclusion is enough, if masculine dominance of official politics has been a crisis. Certainly it is not, but it is a first step. Now we need to understand what would be the more effective leapfrog into that space, which has seemed to be a very difficult undertaking, or a step-by-step approach where you're first included and then carve out that space for decision making and more women to come. So certainly there's room to explore as to how you are going to take those spaces up. But coming back to handshake, certainly it's not the only way to greet each other, but it is the acceptable symbolic gesture, and it's so powerful, especially when you are a minority in the room.
I just want to quickly chime in and say that the handshake to me really kind of represents upholding, the power elite, the agreement between leadership, this hierarchical, top that makes all these decisions for us, instead of engaging the collective. And I think that that's actually the angle that I can see intersect with, patriarchal domination and also capitalism and this, again, power elite hierarchy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's another question from Anne Karagusyan, is the PI director, and it's given the large fraction of women enrolled in Armenia's higher education sector, are there concrete suggestions that Irina or other panelists may have that could alter the climate so that Armenia could benefit from the talents of these well-educated women?
If I may, I'll take that first. One of the suggestions, recommendations we've had in the study we've done in 2015, and I think it holds strong, that's why I brought it as part of the recommendations in today's talk, is public awareness. I think we need to work extensively and continuously and on every platform possible to shape women as equal to men when it comes to decision-making, leadership positions, and spaces that women are essentially absent, but so necessary, as the recent crises have shown. So public awareness can have different shapes and forms. And very recently, I'll give you a specific example. Very recently, I've had an absolute honor and privilege to be part of a group of Armenian feminist intellectuals with whom we started the discussion of making Armenian prominent female figures known to public that they unfortunately are not. When new generations grow up, they need to see images of female heroes as well. And unfortunately, we don't have public spaces where those are present. Armenian government years ago initiated a project called High Metzed, and if you've been to Yerevan or across the country, you've seen the billboards strewn across the country with names of Yerishe Charen, Sovanes Tumanyan, poets, writers, intellectuals. The predominant space is, again, very male, and that bothered all of us to the core, fundamentally, because Armenian women played such a crucial role in the development of our nation, whether it came to healthcare, clothing, educating, developing intellectual thought, science space, but they're not visible. They're not visible through history, and they're not visible today. So we came together and we put together a list of the initial list was actually was quite long, and we still are working on that list. But the first two female prominent figures in Armenian history, Zabelyasan and Shoshani Kurvinyan, after about 6 months of work, we carved out a well-deserved space for public billboards across Yerevan in 6 locations, where Zabelyasan is proudly displayed as, among other descriptions, as feminist. So I think those examples show, and those examples should be many, where we carve out those spaces through visual representation, through text, through articulation of narrative, whichever platforms are there, to start carving out those spaces where women are present and visible as leaders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments on this? I have a question for Karina. Just thinking about your research, and there's much talk about migrants and immigrants' social, cultural, and political remittances, right? In addition to, of course, economic, financial remittances. Do you see this in the role of growing Armenian American community and diaspora in general as instrumental and effective in transforming the gendered landscape and promoting changes we're talking about?
In some ways I do, in some ways I don't. It kind of reminds me of, like, for example, Italians who reproduce old, outdated, nostalgic, dangerous, representations of Italy from 1922 today in the 21st century context. And so I see like kind of threads of that existing in the Armenian American community, that they're just reproducing all these sort of outdated notions of what it means to be, whatever this idea of Armenian or authentic Armenian is, or all the gendered, connotations of that is. And then in some ways, there are some fantastic ways in which they're progressing forward, but these are actually the same folks that are preventing. I don't know if anybody's been to a board of trustees conversation in Glendale, California lately, but they are anti-critical race theory, and they are at the same time, paradoxically establishing, the Armenian Genocide Museum, which takes all these like histories into consideration. So I honestly, quite honestly, kind of measuring things out, I think that it's really like 2 steps back instead of a few more steps forward when it comes to the diaspora and how that's playing out, at least in the LA context. I can only speak to a Los Angeles context. I'm not aware of what's happening in a sort of a more globalized, diasporic reality, and in respect to how that's kind of almost mirroring back progress or regression.
Do you think that this has to do with sort of male domination in the diaspora politics and diasporic discourse, and can that be changed and translated further to the homeland?
I'll open this up to everybody else, but I think that's male domination everywhere, and I think that we have to be really mindful of the fact that representation is one thing. Like, it's fantastic to have all these representations of what, female, authors and artists, but we also need, beyond diversity, an equity mindedness, a critical mindedness that is disruptive to these ideologies that are prevalent in so many different cultures across the world.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, any other comments, observations on anything related directly or indirectly to this panel and the issues that we've discussed, raised, questioned?
There are a few more comments in the chat.
Yeah, let me see that. Having problems accessing them. Yes, I just have to ask you to take a look at those comments and to see if you can address them in the remaining few minutes that we have. I think it's also one comment I think also invites us, I think suggests that we think of Armenian reality in kind of context of and from a comparative perspective of similar context, both post-Soviet and beyond. I think that perspective would also enrich our understanding of the challenges, but also of possibilities. I think that's very, very important. Now, have any? Is there also, Elisa, you had a question to Karina. Karina, can you see that question?
Let me see.
This is kind of follow up.
Yeah, I had to scroll down.
Yeah.
Do you know if any of the Armenian women you worked with during the research have been involved and reached out and or by labor organization, homeless activists? No, I haven't been in contact with many of them because half of my respondents actually returned to Armenia. Half of them were disillusioned with the United States. They did not want to be. I had one woman who was a gynecologist who was, at one of the local bakeries working $1 an hour and without any cigarette breaks with her husband, alongside her husband who had a nervous breakdown in the middle of that work, undocumented employment and exploitative employment. Some of the women, a few of the women I have kept track of, and they've turned into, conservative Trump supporters. So I wanted to throw that out because that's a general trend that I'm seeing here in Los Angeles amongst the Armenian Americans. And I think that there is a lot to say between the correlations between the politics of what's happening in Armenia and of course here, this connectivity, unfortunately. But as far as women reaching out to women's centers, from the little that I got to speak to my respondents with, it's very stigmatizing to go to some of these networks in Armenia for Armenian women, at least from the last conversations I had. And this maybe it was back maybe 5 to 7 years ago, but it was stigmatizing to visit the women's center, for example. I know that some of the women, but not very many, have reached out to the Armenian Benevolent Center in Glendale for assistance.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I guess we are almost out of time. Is that correct, Megan? I think we've had a great conversation. Thank you all very much, and hope we'll be in touch and continue, of course. And of course, I hope that we will all. Yeah, well, I look forward to the rest of this conference. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well,
thank you very much. Yes, so
thank you.
Today's session, a big thank you to you, Professor Alektanyan, and our panel chairs today, our panel chair today, and our wonderful speakers for very insightful and thought-provoking presentations and discussion in the Q&A session. So thank you very much for that. Tomorrow we have another full day. So we have 2 panels tomorrow, again from 11 to 3 Eastern time. So we will be discussing equity and empowerment, creating and distributing resources beyond the gap. That's the first panel tomorrow. And then war, trauma, and displacement, gender, and building peace is the second panel tomorrow. So we hope to see you there. Thank you very much again, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.